A hoarse voice burst from Colonel Zhang's throat, and then he pulled out his communicator, ready to turn on the switch to speak. No need to. Bang! The pale man suddenly knocked the communicator out of Colonel Zhang's hand, and the other two quickly surrounded him upon seeing this. What are you doing? This will lead all the soldiers to their deaths. The pale man shouted loudly, while simultaneously pressing several buttons on the communicator in his hand. Give it to me! Give it to me! Colonel Zhang kept repeating these two words. Seeing this, one of the remaining two prepared to subdue the pale man, while the other hurriedly bent down to pick up the fallen communicator. However, the pale man had awakened his abilities, and his physical fitness far exceeded that of the three who had not awakened their abilities. With a shoulder charge, the chief of staff who came to subdue him was knocked into a corner, while the pale man rushed forward, beating the other chief of staff to it, kicking the communicator away. Ah! Colonel Zhang shouted and ran over, trying to tackle the pale man. Hearing a loud sound, the pale man looked up and met Colonel Zhang's gaze. Madness, brutality, and a hint of bloodlust. Bang, bang, bang. In the lounge of the armored vehicle. Huh? Gu Ziming watched as the countdown was about to reach 0, but was surprised to see that the three little red dots had disappeared. What was going on? Had they been eliminated? But Gu Ziming did not hesitate. When the countdown reached 0, if there was still no news from the base, he would still press the energy launch button. He couldn't just back down after being provoked first, could he? What could change his mind was never whether the enemy was dead or alive. Whether the enemy was dead or alive didn't matter much to him. What he wanted was profit. He was prepared to seize this base. Just when he couldn't find a reason to take control of the base unexpectedly launched missiles at them first. Didn't that give him a reason to take it? As for the enemies, or those with ill will or hostility towards him, eliminating them was merely to prevent future losses to his own interests. If the enemies now, or in the future, could not cause him any loss, then why should he expend effort to eliminate them? From the moment he resolved to become the greatest villain, he understood that those who bore him hostility were endless, not just the righteous and protagonists. Villains would also view him as an enemy. If they could cause him losses, then he would eliminate one if they came, and eliminate a batch if they came in batches. Beep, beep, beep. Beep, beep, beep. Two sounds rang out simultaneously. One was the countdown reaching 0. The other was the information alert from the radio. Gu Ziming looked at the automatic translation from the radio, a smile curling at the corners of his mouth. Of course, there are still smart people inside the base. Hello, we have received your message. Please come to the base for a discussion. The message from the radio was very simple, without indicating any particular stance or mentioning the recent missile battle. It was simply an invitation for Gu Ziming to go to the base. Could this be a trap? Feng Linger glanced at the radio message. Her brows furrowed slightly as she spoke. Whether it's a trap or not, we'll find out when we get there. Gu Ziming replied, sending a new message. Okay. At the same time, he prepared to bring along the military representatives who had been shocked by the missiles outside. Since they wanted to investigate the reason, Gu Ziming felt that the truth would likely emerge from within the base, and bringing them along wouldn't be a problem. After getting out of the car, Gu Ziming walked towards Chun Gang and the others, who were still hiding in the shelter. Everyone, I'm about to head to the northern base. Do you want to come? Chun Gang was taken aback by Gu Ziming's words but quickly realized that a deal must have been struck. Otherwise, the missile battle would have started by now. He looked at the others, saw them all nodding, and then said, Yes. All right, then let's set off. Gu Ziming returned to the vehicle and activated the autopilot mode. Daylight had brightened, and the heat from the sun baked the asphalt road, leaving a deep tire mark from Gu Ziming's RV. The three armored vehicles behind struggled to keep up, but managed to follow along. Soon, Gu Ziming arrived at the northern base. The northern base was much larger than he had expected and was located deep in the mountains. Along the way, he encountered numerous checkpoints. Perhaps because someone had given a heads-up, Gu Ziming and his party were not intercepted or checked. At the entrance of the northern base, the gate had been destroyed by the missile Gu Ziming had launched earlier, and there was a large hole in the surrounding wall, but now the hole had been surrounded by barbed wire. Gu Ziming did not stop the vehicle, but drove straight towards the gate. "Open the gate!" a cold voice echoed. This time it wasn't Gu Ziming shouting, but someone from an armored vehicle ahead of him. The road leading to the base was clearly much better, with no large stones blocking the center of the road. Thus, following the previously devised bodyguard plan, one armored vehicle led the way in front of Gu Ziming's RV, while the other two alternated to drive alongside the RV, mimicking professional protective techniques. Next to the barbed wire gate stood two makeshift tents. One of the guards glanced over, his eyes filled with anger, exuding a fierce aura. A scarred strongman inside the armored vehicle, who was an S-Class Frost ability user named Li Xiaodong, the super-strong representative of the military district, also stared intently at the guard. Gu Ziming observed the two of them staring at each other for half a minute without any movement, so he used his villainous eye to check the guard. As expected, he was also an S-Class ability user with considerable powers. His body was completely hardened. This confirmed Gu Ziming's suspicion that in the current large bases, if one didn't have a few S-Class ability users, they couldn't survive. Bases like the Donghai base, several nearby military district bases, and now this northern base undoubtedly had S-Class strong users. In the storyline with Yihan, S-Class strong users were already considered among the top combat powers, and the female antagonist later on, Feng Linga, was S-Class. Such changes were undoubtedly the result of world fusion. Multiple narrative worlds had merged into the current world, which had clearly become much stronger. This can also explain that during Lin Fan's time, everyone could escape to the Western Plateau and live peacefully. However, now they must run to outer space, because the stronger the main world becomes, the greater the power of apocalyptic disasters. Get in, don't think that this bit of barbed wire can stop your vehicle. Gu Ziming opened the microphone and spoke to the person in front, Gu Xiaodong. Since this voice was coming from outside the RV, the guards naturally heard it. Two people from the tents came out, carrying rifles. Gu Xiaodong shook the scar on his face and said, "All right." After finishing, he quickly engaged the gear, and the vehicle was about to charge forward. Seeing that the guards still had no intention of giving way, the tall, thin man sitting in the back rolled down the window and said to the people outside, "Everyone, we were invited here by your superiors. I don't believe he hasn't told you. If you block our entry here, you are violating military orders. If you don't let us through, you'll have to bear the consequences." The tall, thin man's tone was calm, but these two sentences struck a chord with the guards. Yes, this obstructive act was something they had added to the situation themselves. The missile that had just been fired, although it didn't hit them, the explosion at the main gate still caused them some damage. Not only was the gate smashed and their faces humiliated, but the original guards were also severely injured. Fortunately, they reacted quickly and hid in the air raid shelter beneath the main gate. However, some people in the basement were still shaken by the shockwave of the explosion. So, they intended to take revenge for their brothers. But upon hearing the tall, thin man's words, several people's hot blood instantly cooled down. "Please proceed." After saying this, they hurriedly rolled away the barbed wire. Gu Ziming saw this scene clearly and was also curious about this tall, thin man, feeling like he had seen him before. That's right, the chief of staff of the Western Military District, who was also the second city lord of the apocalyptic city established in the Western Plateau during Lin Fan's storyline, Zhang Chongfeng. As for who the first city lord was, it's needless to say, it must be the protagonist, Lin Fan. Zhang Chongfeng, this chief of staff, was also sent by the Western Military District for investigation. It seems that each military district is quite interested in this change in the imperial capital. Gu Ziming thought to himself. After entering the base, Gu Ziming was surprised to find that there was actually a guiding vehicle leading them forward. Soon, Gu Ziming's RV arrived at the destination, in front of a grayish low house. Gu Ziming felt a bit confused, but seeing that Zhang Chongfeng and Gu Xiaodong had all jumped out of the vehicle, Chun Gang and the others behind also got out. So he guessed that this should be a place resembling a command room in the base. And such a command room, from the outside, looked ordinary, but in reality, if he wasn't mistaken, The real place should still be underground. You all wait in the vehicle for me. I will check the situation first, and then you can come down, Gu Ziming said, looking at the several women who seemed eager to move, but still continued to speak. In the RV, they were absolutely safe, but once they got out, although he could protect them, there would still be a hint of danger. Dad! Dad! Gu Ziming glanced over at Wen Yin, who had been quiet since he started firing. At this moment, she suddenly shouted, Dad? Calling Dad. For some reason, Gu Ziming blurted out this line, causing the atmosphere in the car to become awkward instantly. A few girls shot him annoyed looks, while Wen Yin glared at him angrily. I said, that person outside is my dad. Saying this, Wen Yin ran over and grabbed Gu Ziming's arm, biting down furiously. Gu Ziming deliberately held back his strength. Otherwise, thanks to his body, which had been enhanced multiple times, a simple muscle reflex could have knocked out a tooth from Wen Yin. This girl, although she had been violent before, never acted like this right from the start. At this moment, Gu Ziming looked out the car window and saw a middle-aged man with grizzled hair standing at the entrance of a gray brick wall, squinting slightly as he looked over. Holy crap! Gu Ziming was momentarily stunned to realize that the grizzled-haired man outside was actually his father's friend, Wen Liangong, whom he had often called Uncle Wen when he was little. He never imagined that the over 40-year-old Wen Liangong would have gone completely gray. He hadn't seen him in years since growing up, and Gu Ziming almost didn't recognize him. Oh! Feeling Wen Yin loosen her bite and start to quietly cry against his chest, Gu Ziming patted her back. Now he understood why Wen Yin reacted so strongly. It was probably because she hadn't seen her father in half a year, and now he had turned gray. Plus, all the negative emotions from the apocalypse had been bottled up inside her without any outlet. This was also why she had never accepted Gu Ziming's almost ridiculous requests for interaction. It was because she had been suppressing all those negative feelings without a way to vent. Seeing her father's changes, Gu Ziming's earlier offhand joke finally set off the turmoil in her heart, especially after recently watching him and a few girls fooling around while she felt wronged on the sidelines. Okay, don't cry. Uncle Wen is watching down there. While patting her back, Gu Ziming consoled Wen Yin. The other girls also realized that the middle-aged man who looked like a base commander was indeed Wen Yan's father. Hearing Gu Ziming's comfort, Wen Yin quickly composed herself. She was inherently strong-willed. It was just that since the apocalypse, she had faced too much pressure without a proper outlet. Now that she had vented, Wen Yin reset her mindset. Does it hurt? She pulled on Gu Ziming's arm, still sobbing as she asked. It's fine. You go down and say hello to Uncle Wen first. I'll come down later. Gu Ziming understood what Wen Yin needed at this moment. He also hoped that she would talk to Wen Liangong first. That way, it wouldn't be awkward when he went down later. After all, almost getting her father-in-law blown away felt a bit strange no matter how he thought about it. Okay, I'll explain the situation to him. You almost got into a fight just now. Wen Yin let go of Gu Ziming's arm and said to her father, who was looking over at them. Although Wen Yin had never come from a military background, her upbringing made her more aware than anyone else of the dangers of Gu Ziming's earlier missile standoff with the base. That danger wasn't directed at their RV, but rather at the northern base. If another missile were launched based on her understanding of Gu Ziming, it would certainly result in overwhelming firepower. She had seen the explosion marks at the gate just now, indicating that the base couldn't withstand Gu Ziming's attack at all. She needed to inform her father about all this in advance to prevent any accidental conflict with Gu Ziming later on. Because she was familiar with both Wen Liangong and Gu Ziming, she knew that the emotions between those two wouldn't be problematic. Boop! While Gu Ziming wasn't paying attention, Wen Yin gave a quick peck, then opened the door and walked out. Gu Ziming watched Wen Yan's retreating figure, touched his cheek, and felt a bit strange in his heart. Why does it feel like a brotherly kiss? No, in the future, I still need to keep an eye on Wen Yan's appearance while doing things. Otherwise, I just can't muster the energy to engage with him. They were too familiar with each other, and besides, he was just a person who valued looks. Are you okay? Qin Feifei walked over and tugged at Gu Ziming's arm. She had learned a bit about the childhood friendship between Wen Yin and Gu Ziming. She had heard that Wen Yin was carefree since childhood, and now seeing that slightly shy demeanor, she understood that the timing was ripe. So, even though Wen Yin hadn't acted as Gu Ziming's woman before, she had always interacted with Wen Yin as a sister. I have something. Can you help me massage? Gu Ziming laid down on the sofa, his head resting on a soft spot, and stretched out his arm. 10 minutes passed. At this time, Wen Yin and Wen Liangong walked over together. Upon seeing this, Gu Ziming immediately got up, stepped out, and walked towards the two, saying, "Wenbo, long time no see." "Ziming, I really didn't expect it to be you." Wen Liangong also had a smile on his face and extended his right hand. Seeing this, Gu Ziming reached out to shake it. Although both were smiling and casually exchanging pleasantries, Wen Liangong's face was becoming increasingly flushed, while Gu Ziming continued to talk about business matters calmly. "Ah, it seems you have awakened your special abilities as well. I can rest assured handing Yinner over to you now." Wen Liangong patted Gu Ziming on the shoulder and said. Before Gu Ziming could respond, Wen Liangong turned to Wen Yin and said, "Do you want to stay in the RV, or should I prepare a room for you to rest? I need to talk about some things with your brother Ziming." The Wen family, being a military family, had a straightforward family style. "Ah, I'll stay in the RV. The RV has my sisters accompanying me." After saying this, Wen Yin winked at Gu Ziming and then boarded the RV. Is this how Wen Yin looks when she completely lets go? She seems so carefree. Is this a military habit? Why has she suddenly turned into a delicate lady? Gu Ziming didn't think too much about it. He just turned around to see Wen Liangong with a cold and indifferent expression, feeling somewhat uneasy inside. Wen Liangong didn't say much, but directly led Gu Ziming to the door of a conference room. "Is this the work of your uncle?" The conference room contained 3 bodies with gunshot wounds, and there were still pools of dried blood beneath them. "Yes, they ordered the missiles to be fired at you," Wen Liangong said as he looked at Gu Ziming, trying to gauge his reaction upon learning that his mortal enemies had died in front of him. But unfortunately, Gu Ziming showed no reaction at all. He was calm to the point of being unnervingly calm. Could it be that he doesn't care at all about his enemies' lives and deaths? Not a hint of vengeance or a thrill of revenge or excitement. For the first time, Wen Liangong began to reassess this former rich kid and friend. Gu Ziming looked at the 3 corpses, but his mind was filled with contemplation. Why did these 3 come to kill him, especially using missiles? If someone was indeed controlling them, where was that person hiding now? Furthermore, if these 3 were considered the top power holders of the base, what did that mysterious person want to gain from this? Now that these people were dead at the hands of Wen Liangong, what kind of reaction would follow? A series of questions left him feeling a bit confused. Gu Ziming sensed that the waters of the imperial capital were quite deep. However, as long as he remained invincible and had no weaknesses, he would be in an inherently unassailable position in this confrontation with the mysterious person. Wenbo, now that they are dead, what will happen to the base? Gu Ziming asked Wen Liangong, looking at him. He had thought this would be quite a tricky problem, but unexpectedly, Wen Liangong waved his hand and replied with a smile. "It's nothing. The base has been operating automatically for nearly a month. The nearby search and rescue, as well as the zombie security issues, have already been resolved. Currently, the base has satisfied the basic self-sufficient internal ecological environment structure and basically does not need any changes. Moreover, even if orders need to be issued, I can act as the temporary commander." Seeing Wen Liangong's confident expression, Gu Ziming knew he was not lying. It seemed that besides these 3 individuals, Wen Liangong was the 4th power holder of the base. "Perhaps I can make you the true ruler of this base," Gu Ziming said with a slight smile. Oh, Wen Liangong was somewhat curious. After all, if he could completely control this base, it would represent a significant guarantee for his future survival. Furthermore, he believed that having killed Jiang and the others, he needed to take responsibility for the soldiers below. As for how to take responsibility, it naturally meant leading them to live better in this new world. Gu Ziming certainly did not choose this base to help Wen Liangong out of boredom. Instead, he also saw the utility of this base. According to what he knew, the research institute that Qin Feifei spoke of was nestled between this base and the southern base. The resources and security personnel from the institute were provided by these two large bases. Now that Qin Feifei wanted to research new spacecraft, the amount of materials consumed and the number of engineers needed would be astronomical. Just from the perspective of resources, these two bases might not even be enough. They would require support from the entire nation and even part of the world. Moreover, the number of engineers needed was also enormous. Even though Qin Feifei had a mechanical heart, it was impossible for him to create a spacecraft with his bare hands. This would require a large amount of talent to cooperate. The original text also described that Qin Feifei first utilized domestic resources to create a unique power system, while all other parts relied on the output from various countries' forces. Of course, the boarding quotas for this ship were also partly allocated to others. Now, if Ziming wanted to intervene in this matter, he would need an identity that could be publicly utilized. The leader behind the northern base was a good entry point. Thus, if he could win over Wen Liangong and push him to become the person in charge of this base, it would be the first step for him to become the behind-the-scenes manipulator. As for the spaceship that has been built at the back, when it comes to who boards and who disembarks, that will be decided by Ziming. Perhaps it would be interesting to shift the blame for the stolen spaceship onto Qin Feifei, leaving him to face the wrath of those deceived on Blue Star. However, those methods of handling things can wait. The immediate priority is to successfully take over this northern base. Regarding how to take over this base, Ziming already has some ideas. The first is to clarify the deaths of the three individuals. The story will be that someone controlled them, they went insane, and then when Liangong killed them one by one. To be honest, this is the best choice. There must be relevant experts in the military. Deception could backfire. Moreover, from when Liangong's introduction just now, he learned that the three of them had been living in the command center to minimize exposure risks, and they basically had not met anyone. Additionally, the recent missile launch without reason is the best proof that they were mentally unstable. Second, in addition to the nominal handover, it is necessary to ensure that everyone in the base receives tangible benefits. Although the base currently has sufficient supplies, they are still facing the problems caused by the extreme heat of the apocalyptic world. Don't be fooled by the fact that everyone seems to have gotten used to this hot world. Even the coolest living quarters in the base, with the best heat protection facilities, still reach temperatures of around 40 degrees Celsius. This temperature is equivalent to a hot summer day without air conditioning or fans, forcing everyone to grit their teeth and endure. While it won't lead to death from heat, it is inevitable to suffer from heat stroke or be drenched in sweat if one is not careful. As long as this issue is resolved, the hearts of the people will be firmly in hand. Finally, the person in charge of this base cannot be Ziming himself. He is well aware that even if these military personnel gain more benefits, they would not choose an outsider as their leader. Wen Liangong is a suitable candidate. Although he came with his own troops, he has lived in the base for quite some time, having both personal strength and a solid base of support. Moreover, he can be considered the fourth most important person in the base. With the previous three gone, it is only natural that it falls to him to take the position. With his relationship with Wen Yin, as long as he doesn't do anything that would provoke widespread anger, Wen Liangong would listen to him to some extent. Just now, Ziming used a villain's perspective to assess Wen Liangong's friendliness, and it directly increased to 86. On one hand, it's because Ziming's father was friends with him, making them family friends. On the other hand, with the connections brought by Wen Yin and the strength he just displayed, he has gained the recognition of the father-in-law. What do you think I should do to control the base? Wen Liangong asked when he saw Ziming lost in thought. Simpler than you think. Ziming shared his analysis with Wen Liangong. As for the future planning for the northern base, Ziming only hinted at it, expressing a desire to fully support technological development during the apocalypse. Even with these analyses, Wen Liangong felt his heart racing. This kid has a tight grasp on his thoughts. Entrusting a daughter to such a person might be a good choice in this apocalypse. Yes, now when Liangong truly recognizes Ziming, He may lack experience, but in these unpredictable times, he won't survive long without wisdom. Don't be fooled by his possession of a troop. When Liang Gong himself had to survive numerous life-threatening experiences during the chaos in the imperial capital before he made it to the northern base. He has encountered countless schemes and battles along the way. It is this experience that allowed him to decisively eliminate the three headed by Jiang when he sensed something was wrong. Do you have any solutions to the high-temperature problem? When Liang only raised this question after listening to Gu Ziming's analysis. He found that while he could handle many other issues, he was quite dismissive of the challenge of resisting high-temperature environments. Since Gu Ziming released the famous graphene, various factions have attempted research and imitation, but all have given up due to the high costs involved. In fact, their own production costs for heat-resistant graphene were still significantly higher than the price of purchasing it from Gu Ziming. It was only after the awakening of abilities and the outbreak of the zombie crisis that caused long-distance communication to be cut off that they stopped coming to Gu Ziming to buy the famous graphene materials. Now, Gu Ziming claimed to be solving the heat dissipation problem for the entire base. If he were to use the famous graphene, it could indeed solve the problem, but it was obviously too expensive. It should be noted that their northern base was also stationed with tens of thousands of troops and tens of thousands of civilians. If every building were to be equipped with graphene, the area needed for production would lead to astronomical costs. Gu Ziming couldn't help but smile inwardly. Only they believed the famous graphene was worth the price. Of course, this was also related to his previous high-price sales and their own research results. But in reality, if he were to ramp up production of graphene, the cost per person would be around $100 at most. Even if the entire base had 100,000 people, that would only come to $10 million. Moreover, this was based on the production costs before the apocalypse. Now, not only had the system been upgraded, allowing for the unlocking of more advanced technologies for production, but with Qin Feifei's mental enhancement, he could also design a much cheaper version. In this way, his production cost would be about $10 per person at most, and the total for the entire base would be at most $1 million. Swapping $1 million for the support of a base was a clear profit for him. And who said he had to produce it for free? I can design a lower-cost version of heat-insulating graphene here. The effect might not be as good as the previous one, but it's suitable for large-scale deployment in the current situation. Gu Ziming looked at the buildings already fully exposed to the scorching sun and said, "A wave of heat seems to distort the entire base, leaving only some obstructions still standing on the ground. When can you do it?" When Liang pondered for a moment before reminding, this matter should be addressed as quickly as possible. Seeing this, Gu Ziming realized that when Liang was already fully convinced of the plan he had just proposed, so he said, "If we have the right equipment, we can expect to produce the first batch in 2 days. You will also need some time to renovate the walls. We can produce while you renovate. It will be completely on time." When Liang noticed the key issue in Gu Ziming's words, the need for appropriate equipment, he asked, "What equipment do you need?" "If it's general equipment, I can find a solution here." He knew that Gu Ziming had driven here and had no possibility of bringing equipment with him. Moreover, in his impression, experimental or production equipment was usually quite large, and at least a car wouldn't be able to hold it. Upon hearing his inquiry, Gu Ziming smiled inwardly. Wasn't this the perfect opportunity to go to the research institute? First, he would check on Qin Feifei's experimental progress. Then he would bring Liu Xiaoxiang over. He couldn't let Liu Xiaoxiang and Qin Feifei be in the research institute at the same time. Although in the original storyline, Liu Xiaoxiang developed feelings for the male lead Qin Feifei later on, no one knew where the storyline had strayed now or what would happen in the future. By bringing Liu Xiaoxiang over, he could not only have her and Qin Feifei work together to research the super technology brought about by the upgraded system, but also weaken part of Qin Feifei's good fortune. However, he felt that Qin Feifei should be grateful to him. With no women in his heart, he could focus entirely on research. If he could completely cut off his ties to the mundane world, he could dedicate himself wholeheartedly to researching spaceships. Before I came, I heard there was a national research institute here in the capital. They should have the production equipment I need, Gu Ziming said casually. The Research Institute. When Liangong thought for a moment before decisively saying, "Okay, I'll take you to the Research Institute." However, the Research Institute is jointly controlled by our base and the Southern Capital Base. For some things, I might not have the final say. When Liangong's face grew somewhat grim, and a flash of anger and resentment crossed his eyes, Gu Ziming understood that there were some conflicts between the northern and southern bases, and the origin of this conflict stemmed from the imperial capital's incident that Feng Linger had mentioned. But he didn't have the time to delve into these secrets right now. Once he had Qin Feifei completely focused on building a spaceship for him, he would have time to understand this power struggle. It's fine. What I need are just some ordinary tools. Plus, I know a doctor over there, and one of her students is also here with me. We can talk to her when we get to the Research Institute. Gu Ziming looked at the time and realized it was almost noon. He then invited Wen Liang on. "Do you want to have lunch in my car? After lunch, you can handle your base's report while I go to my Research Institute." When Liangong nodded, glanced at the already somewhat shriveled corpse, and said, "Let me handle things here first. I'll come over at noon." "Okay, I'll wait for you at noon. Don't forget, Yinner is also waiting for you in the car." Gu Ziming waved his hand and turned to walk outside. "You brat, is Yinner also yours?" When Liangong looked at Gu Ziming's departing figure and laughed while scolding, then he started to deal with the scene. Although it was close to noon and the sun was scorching, with temperatures soaring above 70 degrees, it was still bearable for someone with abilities. A super sumptuous lunch left when Liangong, completely convinced by Gu Ziming. The extremely fresh fish and shrimp, along with vegetables that seemed to have just been picked from the ground, were all things that could not possibly appear in the apocalypse. Yet they were all right in front of Wen Liangong. However, he did not pry into where Gu Ziming had sourced this food. Everyone has their own secrets. To him, it was clear that Gu Ziming had gone all out for the sake of face, and acquiring such fresh food must have been quite difficult, so he felt it inappropriate to expose it. Gu Ziming's attitude towards him was still very pleasing, as it also meant he respected Wen Yin, which reassured him about leaving his daughter in the RV. As for the other girls in the RV, seeing that his daughter got along with them like sisters, he did not pursue anything further. After all, this was the apocalypse. In the Imperial Capital Research Institute, there was a vast laboratory. The so-called vast laboratory was actually a space research lab, specifically designed for Professor Yang Haoan. At this moment, Qin Feifei and Professor Yang were sitting together, smoking heavily, causing the smoke to swirl around in the originally smoke-free lab, making their faces appear hazy. "Chu, I've tested over 1,000 types of materials, but I still haven't found the suitable one you need." Yang Haoan had been thoroughly impressed by Qin Feifei's extensive knowledge, and they had begun to call each other brothers. "Brother, if there's no material that balances thermal conductivity and toughness, there's no way to create the engine for a four-curve microparticle engine." Qin Feifei scratched his head. He hadn't intended to pursue this method for the spacecraft's power design. However, this was the only way for him to leap from being an obscure lab assistant to becoming the chief scientist at the institute. Only then could he get the other researchers to willingly provide him with some resources. Watching a specially made material board melt and form a small hole, he felt exceptionally frustrated. He had a solution, but lacked the necessary materials. It was like having a mountain of gold, yet being unable to access it, which made him feel extremely uncomfortable. At that moment, Professor Yang suddenly slapped his forehead and exclaimed, "If you need good thermal conductivity, actually Dr. Liu has a material. The graphene thermal conductive material she designed can perfectly meet your thermal conductivity requirements, but it lacks toughness." Qin Feifei curled his lip. He didn't believe there was anyone in this world whose technology surpassed his. He had interacted with this so-called Dr. Liu, who was merely a bit of a genius. But now, he had gained mechanical insights, and being a genius was just a threshold to reach him. Despite his pride, Qin Feifei still humbly asked, "The material invented by Dr. Liu has excellent thermal conductivity?" "Yes, especially after being improved by someone named Gu Ziming. Not only does the thermal conductivity remain excellent, but the production cost has also decreased significantly." Of course, when Professor Yang mentioned the lower price, It was relative to the version that could only exist in the laboratory, which was the one they had asked Dr. Liu to procure some of her key installations, significantly improving their work environment. Gu Ziming. For some reason, as soon as Qin Feifei heard this name, he felt an inexplicable restlessness in his heart. It was like walking down the street and feeling someone following him, only to turn around and find no one there. After searching through the original memories, Qin Feifei discovered that Gu Ziming was just a somewhat famous second-generation rich kid. Nothing to worry about. Maybe he has been too anxious lately. Yes, that Gu Ziming seems to have improved a type of graphene, but it cannot be denied that the thermal conductivity of that graphene is better than any currently mass-produced materials. Is that material still available? I'll see if I can replicate its structure. Qin Feifei felt a stir in his heart and said so. If Gu Ziming can improve graphene, then he should be able to make some adjustments too, increasing its toughness a bit. Wouldn't that work? If Gu Ziming knew about this, he would definitely laugh out loud. Qin Feifei inherited the mechanical technology of humanity 200 years later, which, although much more advanced than current technology, still existed within the broader framework of human knowledge. The simplified version that Gu Ziming created initially came directly from the system and did not belong to the existing human technological system. No matter how much Qin Feifei researched for another 10 years, it would be impossible to replicate it. At the Research Institute, at the entrance. All right, we're here. Gu Ziming looked at the gates of the wall, which were covered in claw marks from zombies, feeling a bit curious. Something must have happened here back then, right? First, an armored vehicle cleared the way. This time, when Liang and Gong Yin had already made arrangements, so they directly entered the core area of the Research Institute, and there was someone specifically waiting for them in the lobby. Leading the group was Yang Haohan, with Liu Xiaoxiang beside him, and behind Professor Yang was his younger brother Qin Feifei. Teacher, Qin Feifei spotted Liu Xiaoxiang from the car and couldn't help but shout out loud. Unfortunately, from Liu Xiaoxiang's perspective, it just looked like a giant RV, and she couldn't see anything inside. Moreover, she couldn't hear any sound from the car. Gu Ziming opened the car door, and a wave of heat was about to hit him, but unfortunately, it was neutralized by an invisible layer of icy air. As a result, when the few women got out of the car, they completely forgot they were in a post-apocalyptic world with temperatures over 70 degrees, thinking they were in an air-conditioned room. Gu Ziming, accompanied by several stunningly beautiful women and followed by a tall bodyguard in tactical gear, instantly attracted the attention of those inside. That guy is so handsome. Which big shot is here to inspect? A few male and female assistants in the welcoming team whispered and discussed. Seeing this, Yang Haohan hurriedly approached. He had an energy barrier protecting him, so he wasn't too afraid of the scorching heat for a short time, and he had also heard about Gu Ziming's improved graphene, believing he was a genius like Qin Feifei. As for the beautiful women and bodyguards, he didn't find it strange. Although he was in the Research Institute, he wasn't completely oblivious to the outside world and was somewhat aware of how people interacted in the apocalypse. Plus, his emotional intelligence wasn't low. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the chief representative of the Research Institute. President Gu, welcome to the Research Institute. Saying this, Yang Haohan took a couple of steps forward and shook hands with Gu Ziming. Behind him, Qin Feifei looked at the exceptionally impressive Gu Ziming and felt an unintentional surge of ambition in his heart. A true man should be like this. Research Institute, Underground Laboratory. Gu Ziming had arrived at a small-scale graphene production experimental laboratory. This laboratory specialized in material research, and coincidentally, Liu Xiaoxiang and a few other women were nearby. Seeing Liu Xiaoxiang here, Gu Ziming approached and greeted her. Professor Liu, it's good to see you. We're about to conduct an experiment related to graphene materials. Would you like to join us? He hadn't greeted Liu Xiaoxiang in the lobby earlier, partly because Professor Yang was continuously introducing things, making it hard to interrupt, and partly because he noticed Liu Xiaoxiang's somewhat displeased expression. As for why she was displeased, Gu Ziming didn't know for sure, but he thought it was impossible to give up the whole forest for just one tree. Now that he saw her, it seemed that her displeasure had subsided, and he observed that she interacted well with a few other women, so he prepared to take this opportunity of the experiment to try again. Perhaps she would come down from her high horse? Great! I heard from Feifei that you've improved a version of graphene. Lu Xiaoxiang listened to Gu Ziming's straightforward invitation and didn't express any dissatisfaction. Instead, she tactfully kept the conversation focused on the experiment. In the research institute, it wasn't appropriate to discuss other matters, and she was attracted to Gu Ziming precisely because of his talent and calm demeanor. Meanwhile, Qin Feifei, who had initially been in shock from the mechanical heartbeat, was instantly awakened when he heard the conversation between Gu Ziming and Lu Xiaoxiang. For some reason, seeing their close interaction made him feel uncomfortable. Qin Feifei's heart felt a bit sour. Why did Gu Ziming have several stunning beauties already, yet he still sought out Lu Xiaoxiang? Just as Qin Feifei was entangled in why he felt this way, someone else entered the laboratory. After sanitizing and putting on a lab coat, Gu Ziming approached the experimental table. This time, the graphene technology cost Gu Ziming 100,000 luck points, but considering his current wealth, this was nothing. Next, he sequentially prepared the materials, mixing and processing them. While everyone was not watching, Gu Ziming secretly added a bit of raw material he had purchased from the system. This was the real reason for the qualitative change in production. Otherwise, with the current processing conditions in this laboratory, he might not succeed even in a year. Lu Xiaoxiang watched Gu Ziming operating methodically at the table, and her heart became increasingly chaotic. At this moment, she seemed to recall the afternoon when Gu Ziming first came to learn from her. A ray of sunlight shone on Gu Ziming's youthful face, and his actions were still somewhat clumsy, yet he was exceptionally serious and focused, as if immersed in his own world. Since childhood, she had been strictly required by her mother to study, and she hadn't had the opportunity to date from elementary school all the way to her doctorate. After that, working in research left her even less time to interact with suitable men. That afternoon scene unexpectedly gave her the feeling of a first love, which was why she had remained single all this time. It wasn't that no one pursued her. It was just that Gu Ziming's figure lingered in her heart. Now, that figure appeared again, and he seemed more mature than before, which completely dispelled the last bit of hesitation in her heart. Lu Xiaoxiang kept watching Gu Ziming, unaware that someone was watching her. Indeed, since entering the laboratory, Qin Feifei's thoughts and gaze had been fixed on Lu Xiaoxiang. He thought his feelings for Lu Xiaoxiang were merely physical attraction, but when Lu Xiaoxiang turned her gaze to Gu Ziming, it felt like a knife cutting through his heart. Wait, Lu Xiaoxiang likes talented and smart people. Qin Feifei glanced at Gu Ziming, who was still making graphene materials, and his heart filled with anger. This is nothing at all. As long as he creates an unparalleled spaceship, Gu Ziming wouldn't even be worthy of carrying his shoes. 2 hours passed in the blink of an eye. Gu Ziming extracted a palm-sized piece of graphene from the machine and said to everyone, "It's a success." These 3 light words, however, struck the hearts of those present like a clap of thunder, sending ripples through the crowd. Everyone present was not a novice in research. Apart from Zhao Xiaoyu and a few others, as well as Qin Feifei, who came to observe Gu Ziming's practical demonstration, most were leaders in their own fields. Moreover, they had previously organized a group to tackle the challenge of mass-producing this special graphene. Let alone 2 hours, even 2 weeks, 2 months, or even 2 years, they might not have been able to produce it themselves. They had come here simply to observe the researchers' thought process, broaden their horizons, and alleviate their obsession from the previous group research. They never expected Gu Ziming would actually manage to produce it right under their noses. Although he didn't provide a detailed explanation or theoretical basis, just watching Gu Ziming's operation was already a significant gain for them. Why? This was the most standard and concise procedure provided by the system. Without any redundant operations or logic, it advanced their own thinking further. What surprised everyone was that the usually aloof and icy Lu Xiaoxiang was the first to rush up, engaging in a passionate and crazy interaction with Gu Ziming. Just moments ago, Qin Feifei had whispered something into Lu Xiaoxiang's ear. Upon hearing this, Lu Xiaoxiang's cheeks instantly turned red, and she couldn't help but shout before running up. What was going on? Gu Ziming didn't expect Lu Xiaoxiang to be so wild. Gu Ziming, I want to ask you for advice. Qin Feifei, who had been focused on Lu Xiaoxiang, finally couldn't hold back any longer and shouted. There was no challenge involved. Qin Feifei decided to interrupt the two's intimate moment under the guise of seeking advice. He knew that if he mentioned a challenge, it would be purely self-deprecating. Since ancient times, there has been no first in literature and no second in martial arts. The same applies to research. If he were to claim a challenge, others would instantly feel indifferent or even disgusted with him because such behavior is immature, irrational, and reckless. Asking for advice, on the other hand, reflected humility, and it also provided a way to undermine Gu Ziming without harming himself. If he were to present a better method of production later, then the impressive skills Gu Ziming had just demonstrated would only serve as a stepping stone for him. Indeed, his confidence stemmed from the mechanical core within him. After Gu Ziming successfully produced the graphene, the mechanical core pulsated to its utmost, upgrading itself. He speculated that this upgrade was the mechanical core signaling him that he needed to experience more high-tech products to continuously unlock its functions. The recently unlocked function of the mechanical core was Host Mechanical Operation Level Max, which meant he had reached the highest level of excellence. His hands would be as steady as a robot, not missing a beat. And it was precisely because of this skill that he discovered many flaws in Gu Ziming's operation. Had he been the one to do it, he would certainly have done it more perfectly than Gu Ziming. Want to learn? Sure, just call me adoptive father. On stage, Qin Feifei moved quickly, like a skilled magician, with his fingers dancing continuously. Bottles of reagents and materials just used by Gu Ziming were constantly being stacked and reacted again. The crowd was taken aback by this. It seemed similar to Gu Ziming's earlier operations, but it appeared that Qin Feifei was completing the tasks even faster. The audience shifted their gazes back and forth between Qin Feifei and Gu Ziming, some feeling puzzled. Was it possible that Qin Feifei was correct? Did he really have a more effective method of operation? As they thought about this, some people began to anticipate Gu Ziming's reaction to what was happening. Gu Ziming, observing Qin Feifei's amazing performance, couldn't help but smile slightly. Qin Feifei, I clearly gave you a chance to step down, so why do you insist on taking the stage to perform? Must you play the fool? As the operations became smoother, the reactants began to resemble those that Gu Ziming had demonstrated. Qin Feifei gradually gained confidence. This time, his daring decision to take the stage was not only to slap Gu Ziming's face, but also because his mechanical heart had started beating again. A voice within him whispered that as long as he created a technological item that met the criteria of the mechanical heart, he would regain a certain ability. And the graphene in Gu Ziming's hands just happened to fit the requirements of the mechanical heart. It was worth noting that the last item that met the mechanical heart's criteria was something as complex as a four-curve particle engine, while the graphene seemed much simpler in comparison. Hence, he was determined to go all out to create it now. One reason was to embarrass Gu Ziming, and the other was to obtain the ability more quickly. However, as Qin Feifei continued his operations, a chill began to rise from the depths of his heart, and cold sweat started to bead on his forehead. Something isn't right, Qin Feifei murmured as he felt the semi-finished graphene in his hand. With a mechanical heart, he could easily sense that the item in his hand was different from what Gu Ziming had demonstrated before. When did he make a mistake? Qin Feifei's mind became more and more chaotic, and his hands began to tremble slightly. Professor Yang, who was also a top figure in the field, noticed Qin Feifei's panic. However, he did not see any differences in the item Qin Feifei held. In his memory, Qin Feifei's and Gu Ziming's operations only differed in motion, but the essence was still quite similar. Ziming, did Qin Feifei make a mistake? A soft voice whispered in Gu Ziming's ear, accompanied by a fragrant breeze that made his heart flutter. It was Lu Xiaoxiang speaking intimately to him for the first time, and her face was slightly flushed. Just moments ago, Qin Feifei had noticed the differences in the material in Qin Feifei's hands and quietly hinted to Lu Xiaoxiang. For this piece of graphene, Qin Feifei was more familiar with it than anyone else besides Gu Ziming and instantly recognized the distinction. When she was about to speak up, She noticed that her teacher had never focused on the stage, but seemed to be gazing at Gu Ziming with an almost imperceptible intensity. This made her heart leap with joy. It seemed she had found the right ally. So, she quietly approached Lu Xiaoxiang and shared a piece of information with her, hoping that she could secure Gu Ziming's support early on. Recently, her close friend Feng Ling had been preoccupied with thoughts of the capital's changes, while Zhao Xiaoyu and the others had become infatuated with the wild style, leaving her as the only player who loved both food and fun, enjoying her solo beauty. Now, it was evident that her teacher had a similar intention, so it was better to take advantage of the situation. Northern Base. At this time, it had been a week since Gu Ziming went to the research institute. Professor Yang had already moved all the laboratory equipment over, so Gu Ziming set up a simple production factory here at the Northern Base. The factory was not large, only about 100 square meters, primarily because it needed to avoid drawing attention. The difficulty of producing enough special graphene to satisfy the entire Northern Base was completely different from just producing a single prototype. The energy required for single production was not a small amount. Therefore, Gu Ziming chose to utilize the laboratory equipment loaded onto the RV for production. In the RV, both energy and operation were fully automated, so Gu Ziming did not need to engage in any operations at all. It was both convenient and efficient. As for the production factory, it was only responsible for simple cutting and loading for shipping. Ziming, your efficiency is quite impressive. When Liang Gong brought a group of people to collect the harvest, and, seeing Gu Ziming lounging in a chair in the factory, couldn't help but say, "I worked overtime last night to get this done, just so everyone could enjoy the coolness a bit earlier, right?" Gu Ziming did not get up and fanned himself with a fan as he spoke. The first batch produced from the modified graphene had already decorated this factory, which Gu Ziming referred to as an experimental effect. Currently, this underground factory could reach over 40 degrees during the day, which was a drop of more than 10 degrees compared to before. Of course, for Gu Ziming, the temperature didn't matter. With his ice powers, even fire wouldn't be a problem. Sitting here was just to give everyone in the base a good impression. I'm working so hard to help everyone produce graphene, so everyone should support me later, right? Gu Ziming guessed to himself, then checked the friendliness levels of several personnel. Indeed, most were around 60 or 70. This was not low among professional military personnel. Ziming, I didn't just come to collect graphene this time. I have something to discuss with you. When Liang Gong had his subordinates carry the graphene while he walked over to Gu Ziming. Oh, is it about the southern base? Of course, Gu Ziming had not been watching the factory the entire time. In fact, he had already used spatial displacement to check the entire imperial capital. Know thyself, know thy enemy. 100 battles, 100 victories. The entire imperial capital felt like a dormant volcano, seemingly calm, but with various forces churning beneath the surface. The most puzzling thing for him was the southern base. No one there had shown him any obvious hostility. Since he was attacked by a missile, he had been searching for the mastermind behind the scenes. Aside from the 3 controlled individuals that when Liang Gong eliminated, the mastermind seemed to have completely disappeared, leaving no traces. Originally, he was most suspicious of the people from the southern base. After he took a round there, he found nothing. However, this made him feel even more suspicious. How could such a large base have absolutely no issues at all? Right, it's the southern base. They've heard that you're currently producing graphene, so they hope you can help them produce some too. When Liang Gong observed Gu Ziming's expression as he spoke. After several discussions with his daughter and spending time with Gu Ziming, he had somewhat understood the character of this prospective son-in-law. He was a typical character who would not give away anything without getting something in return. Just now, the people from the southern base spoke very concisely, only requesting Gu Ziming to provide graphene, without mentioning any rewards or processes. When Liang Gong knew well the nature of those in power who had controlled things for so long, they would not be as easy to negotiate with as he was. When Liang Gong supported Gu Ziming for 2 reasons. First, because of the warm relationship and friendship with his father's generation, and second, because he had high hopes for Gu Ziming and wanted to bet on him. Thus, when Liangong was able to let Gu Ziming and his few bodyguards settle into the base. It should be noted that currently, the base could hardly tolerate strong individuals like Gu Ziming entering. The power structure inside had already been fixed, and the rulers did not want any unstable factors to appear. Unless an unstable factor had already emerged, requiring strong individuals like Gu Ziming to join in order to solve problems, only then would they consider bringing in newcomers. At the same time, he strongly supported the cosmic aerospace project that Gu Ziming mentioned. The resources at the Research Institute had recently become quite abundant, all thanks to Gu Ziming's requests. However, the southern base would not think this way. Their logic in business affairs was to prioritize stability, and they did not want any changes at all. Impossible, absolutely impossible, when Liangong said directly, without a hint of hesitation. Why? Is it because of the southern base? Gu Ziming didn't expect that his suggestion would provoke such a strong reaction from Liangong. Not just because of the southern base, although that is indeed part of the reason. The more important thing is that the Research Institute cannot be relocated, when Liangong said, lighting a cigarette, his eyes slightly squinting, and his tone somewhat somber. Seeing when Liangong's reaction, Gu Ziming seemed to grasp something in his mind and asked, "Is it about the upheaval in the imperial capital?" Just then, a voice called from outside, "Time to eat." It was Wen Yin, who at that moment radiated a mature charm, like a freshly picked juicy peach, round and plump, exuding fragrance. After finding her true feelings, Wen Yin had completely opened her heart and naturally became Gu Ziming's woman. In the past few days, she had thoroughly matured under Gu Ziming's influence. She was no longer the tomboyish military girl she used to be. Instead, she had let her long hair down and taken on the role of a typical housewife. Well, I don't know much about that upheaval in the imperial capital. I'll tell you more later. You should head back now, when Liangong waved his hand, signaling Gu Ziming to hurry back and not keep his daughter waiting. As for him, he chose to stay at the military camp and eat with everyone in the cafeteria. Recently, Gu Ziming had also donated a batch of supplies to the base, which had upgraded the quality of the food. Now was the time for Gu Ziming to exert influence through various means. So when Liangong had to set an example, since the entire Research Institute can't be moved, then I can move a little less. Tomorrow, I'll personally talk to Professor Yang, Gu Ziming casually said. The true value of the Research Institute was not in the land or equipment, but in the talents. And talent cannot be separated from people. As long as he could attract a small group over, providing enough food and resources, he wasn't worried about not being able to bring them over. After speaking, Gu Ziming stretched lazily and headed outside the factory. "Where's my dad?" Wen Yin had seen when Liangong entered the factory, but hadn't seen him come out. She turned to Gu Ziming and asked curiously, "Isn't he right here?" Gu Ziming replied with a smile. Immediately, Wen Yin looked around and only saw Gu Ziming's smiling face, suddenly realizing the implication of her earlier words. She reached out and playfully slapped Gu Ziming, pretending to be angry. "Are you up to no good again?" In the Research Institute, the supercomputer room. "Success! We finally succeeded." A hoarse shout erupted. Qin Feifei bounced around, shouting loudly, his joy erupting like a volcano. Was the calculation successful? Professor Yang beside him adjusted his glasses, his tone trembling slightly as he asked. "Yes, I finally derived the design plan for the four-curve particle engine." Qin Feifei ran up to Professor Yang, excitedly hugging and kissing him. It turned out that after fainting that day, Qin Feifei's mental strength had been greatly developed, unlocking nearly 20% of the mechanical heart. With the power of the mechanical heart and the special graphene designed by Gu Ziming, he had derived the feasibility plan for constructing a spaceship engine. After waking from his fainting spell, Qin Feifei was like a completely different person. He became silent and focused solely on his project, no longer bringing up his desire to try making special graphene. Professor Yang thought Qin Feifei had matured after experiencing setbacks and was no longer like a young boy trying to prove himself. However, he didn't realize that after learning that Liu Xiaoxiang had also left with Gu Ziming, Qin Feifei had completely twisted and evolved. As someone who considered himself the protagonist destined for greatness, Being outshone by a rich second generation who took away his goddess was a humiliation he could not bear. Although Gu Ziming had some skills, after secretly testing the graphene samples left behind from Gu Ziming's experiments, he discovered the reasons for his own failures. He found that in the last few steps, the semi-finished product exhibited a miraculous change. A change he couldn't describe, but his instincts told him that Gu Ziming had definitely added something that caused this transformation. Perhaps it was this world's unique individuals with special abilities. After thousands of simulations and analyses, he discovered that the only variable was this: special energy. Thus, his only goal now was to obtain special energy. With special energy, he, Qin Feifei, would not be inferior to Gu Ziming. Through his memories, Qin Feifei learned that the source of this special energy came from cosmic rays. So he wanted to chase after those cosmic rays with the spaceship. However, this was just one of his goals for advancing the spaceship. Thinking of another goal, or perhaps a more significant one, a glint of malice flashed in Qin Feifei's eyes. He wanted to use his status as the spaceship designer to prevent Gu Ziming from boarding the spaceship, leaving him to wait for death alone on Blue Star. The next day, early morning, Gu Ziming drove his self-driving Super RV to the Research Institute. He planned to relocate the Research Institute to the northern base in 3 steps. The first step was to provide comprehensive experimental support to Professor Yang and Qin Feifei, allowing their projects to fully launch. The second step was about the spaceship project, which, without a doubt, would still require Gu Ziming's support, as it wouldn't be enough on its own. So when they hit a bottleneck again, the first person they would think of would be him, who had always supported them. At that point, he could smoothly propose relocating their research team to the northern base. The final step, which was the most crucial, was to let the others at the Research Institute see just how vast the benefits and resources were with Gu Ziming's support. At a critical moment, when he suggested moving together, most of those people would likely go along with it. Of course, there would be many difficulties in this plan, such as Qin Feifei not accepting his goodwill, or others feeling envious of the conditions at the northern base, but unwilling to relocate. However, he could offer an irresistible condition: their lives. Thinking of this, he became curious about what Qin Feifei had been doing these past few days. After all, Qin Feifei had worked hard to establish a genius persona, but that had been completely lost during the graphene production experiment. Xiaoxiang, what kind of person is Professor Yang? Gu Ziming, feeling the soft figure in his arms, asked while yawning. Why are you suddenly interested in Professor Yang? Lu Xiaoxiang had yet to shake off her habit of being active at night, so she appeared quite energetic as she countered his question. Isn't it to bring Professor Yang to our base? I want to find out in advance if there's anything he cares about. Gu Ziming then informed Lu Xiaoxiang about the relocation of the Research Institute and the impending apocalypse. The other women already knew their purpose for heading north was to build a spaceship to escape this collapsing world. Due to Lu Xiaoxiang's focus on venting the negative emotions accumulated since the apocalypse, she had been behaving recklessly and hadn't considered any serious matters during her moments of clarity. You mean our Blue Star will fall into an even greater disaster in less than 3 years? Lu Xiaoxiang jumped out of Gu Ziming's arms and turned to face him in surprise. Yes, if we seriously observe the signs of solar activity, you will find that the sun is continuously expanding. Moreover, the ecological environment of Blue Star has changed significantly since the outbreak of the apocalypse. Gu Ziming's rare serious expression made Lu Xiaoxiang somewhat convinced. She recalled the recent visit of a research team from the island nation to their institute. It was said that due to the massive melting of polar ice caps, sea levels had risen dramatically, and some marginal cities in their country were on the verge of being submerged. Thus, the island nation's government began considering strategies to cope with the apocalypse, the most significant being the hope to build a city for survival on the western plateau of their country. If we rebuild civilized cities on the western plateau, can we survive the apocalypse? Lu Xiaoxiang asked this question, as deep down, she still hoped to stay on Blue Star. This was because when she was a child, her parents took her to travel the world, but unfortunately, they met with an accident on the way back. This world was not just a survival planet for her. It was also a vessel filled with memories of her parents. Even though this vessel had been ravaged by the apocalypse, as long as she remained on this planet, her heart felt as though it could sense her parents' calls. Gu Ziming noticed her reluctance and sadness, so he said nothing and pulled her back into his embrace, holding her tightly. Leaving Blue Star was a predetermined plan. He could not pause it just because of Lu Xiaoxiang. Moreover, it was an inevitable reality that conditions on Blue Star would continue to deteriorate until the world ultimately perished. But he was not someone who lacked sensitivity. It wasn't just about traveling the world, right? Rebuilding a world was also possible. Of course, this would occur after the foundational spaceship was built and upgraded. For now, the most important thing was to secure the Research Institute. Before Gu Ziming could ask again, Lu Xiaoxiang took a deep breath, looked up at him, and said, "I have no family left. You are my family. Wherever you go, I will go." With that, Lu Xiaoxiang suddenly pulled him in and stamped a seal on him. Was I just stamped against my will? After a while, the two separated, and Lu Xiaoxiang, slightly out of breath, said, "Professor Yang is the chief scientific representative of the Research Institute. He has no children and has devoted his life to research. This is what he values most: achieving technological advancement for humanity. Especially after the apocalypse erupted, he is convinced that the changes in the sun are irreversible and will undergo exponential changes over time." During the discussions at that time, he had heated arguments with others, and they nearly fought. So, he is a staunch representative of the faction that wishes to detach from Blue Star. This is both his weakness and his strength. He strongly hopes to create a spaceship to take people to the universe. Lu Xiaoxiang didn't elaborate further, as she had previously been considered part of the conservative faction, and her understanding of Professor Yang was based on hearsay and her own analysis. That makes things easier. Gu Ziming stroked the high-tech watch on his wrist and said, "Let's use technology to impress him." He had initially thought Professor Yang was the kind of stubborn academic who wouldn't budge, but his performance in the lab last time didn't match that of a tech fanatic. Instead, he had acted like a cunning politician. Thinking about it, if he weren't a tech enthusiast, he wouldn't have become the chief of a talent-rich research institute, and he wouldn't have directly promoted Qin Feifei due to her talent. "Ziming, we still have a while before we reach the Research Institute. Let's have some late-night snacks first." At that moment, Qin Wanner and the other women entered the RV's living room. They were used to sleeping at night, but seeing Gu Ziming heading to the Research Institute at such an early hour, they decided to stay up as well. There was no choice. The Research Institute operated on a nocturnal schedule. The purpose of this trip to the Research Institute was to recruit talent, so Gu Ziming had adapted to local customs, choosing to talk to them at night. Looking at a bowl of steaming tang yuan in front of him, Gu Ziming thought about his opening remarks from meeting Professor Yang later. 4 o'clock in the morning. There's still a little while until dawn, and at this time, Gu Ziming has already arrived at the Research Institute. Unlike the last time when he came as a representative of the northern base, this time Gu Ziming is here to find Professor Yang and Qin Feifei. Therefore, after passing through the protective perimeter of the Research Institute, he directly came to Professor Yang's aerospace laboratory. The lights are on, and everyone in the laboratory is focused on their own tasks, while Professor Yang is pacing in the hall, seemingly muttering something to himself. "Professor Yang, sorry to keep you waiting." As Gu Ziming entered the hall and spotted Professor Yang, he went over to greet him. It seemed that Professor Yang didn't hear him and continued to mumble things like "not enough, not enough." When Gu Ziming got closer, Professor Yang finally noticed him and exclaimed, "Ah." He then slapped his forehead and said, Sorry, Mr. Gu. I heard you were coming over, and I was preparing to welcome you, but I suddenly thought of something and got lost in it." Saying this, Professor Yang took out a notebook he carried with him to show Gu Ziming as proof that he had indeed been thinking deeply. One must admit that Professor Yang really knows how to handle people, while also maintaining his dedication to scientific research. Gu Ziming smiled and responded, "It's nothing. I just arrived as well. By the way, Professor, have you eaten?" Hearing that Gu Ziming didn't mind, Professor Yang immediately breathed a sigh of relief because he knew that Gu Ziming was here to deliver supplies for his research project, and he must not be careless. If such a trivial matter made Gu Ziming change his mind. He wouldn't even know where to cry. However, he was a bit surprised to hear Gu Ziming ask if he had eaten, and he waved his hand to reply. There's still some time until I take a break, so I haven't eaten yet. Then in that case, let me treat you to this. As Gu Ziming said this, he opened a box he was holding. A bowl of glutinous rice balls suddenly appeared in front of the professor. Professor Yang was unsure about the meaning behind Gu Ziming's offering of the rice balls, but he didn't refuse and took a bite. In an instant, a refreshing taste spread throughout his body, fading gently in his mind, leaving a pleasant aftertaste. Indeed, what Gu Ziming had prepared for him was a bowl of glutinous rice balls with sweet osmanthus syrup. Given Professor Yang's status, he certainly didn't lack food, and he wouldn't casually accept food from others. However, since Gu Ziming was an acquaintance and soon to be an investor, eating a bowl of rice balls wasn't a big deal. But to his surprise, these rice balls were actually cold, and the filling was fresh osmanthus syrup. This was something quite difficult to obtain nowadays. Not to mention that fresh osmanthus syrup was extremely rare. There was also a shortage of cold food in the research institute. Due to tight electricity supply, the base only received power quotas for essential needs, and cooling cooked food would be a total waste. How is it? There are plenty of rice balls. Let's have a little snack and take a break. Gu Ziming looked at Professor Yang's surprised expression and suggested. That's enough. That's enough. We can't waste Mr. Gu's food. Professor Yang immediately shook his head in denial. He didn't want to eat all the food himself. He just felt that receiving this gesture was enough. This already indicated a closer relationship between the two, and consuming more of Gu Ziming's food supplies would be purely greedy. It's nothing. I've mastered a technology for rapid plant growth. The glutinous rice you eat and the osmanthus syrup, their raw materials growth period has been controlled to about 1 month to 3 months. Gu Ziming smiled and said, seeing the doubt on Professor Yang's face, he added, they are all completely compliant with edible standards and even exceed the requirements we established before. Hearing this, Professor Yang was instantly excited. What had he just been thinking about? It was the food supply issue for spacecraft. One must understand that the amount of food an individual consumes in a lifetime far exceeds their body weight. In the spacecraft they designed, besides accommodating people, they also had to consider the supplies for them. Perhaps for 1 or 2 people, or even a dozen, it would be manageable. But what about thousands or tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of people? The amount of supplies required would be astronomical. If there weren't suitable renewable resource methods, and they just thought of consuming without planning, how much supply would they need? Therefore, the spacecraft Professor Yang envisioned should resemble a biosphere ecological farming system. However, these technologies were only vaguely understood by people at present, and they couldn't really implement rapid changes, let alone those that violate natural laws. Seeing the shocked expression on Professor Yang's face, Gu Ziming knew that these technologies were truly powerful tools for him. As a technology enthusiast, he couldn't just think about the manufacturing of the spacecraft. It was much more important to modify the spacecraft to make it more suitable for human survival. If it were just simple support, Professor Yang wouldn't be so easily convinced. If he wanted to convince him, he had to present something that would truly astonish him. Laboratory hall. Everyone held a cup of icy hot dumpling soup, enjoying it immensely. Boss Gu, you're so generous. Thank you, Boss Gu. This is so much more comfortable. I never imagined, even after the apocalypse, I could still enjoy such cold, fresh dumpling soup. Some of the more easygoing researchers were quite enthusiastic and started praising Gu Ziming right there in the hall. To this, Gu Ziming didn't say much. He couldn't exactly say that there was so much supply he couldn't finish it, right? However, at one of the experiment tables, Qin Feifei's aloof figure stood out awkwardly against the cheerful atmosphere. Yes, Qin Feifei was still engrossed in his research, not even glancing at Gu Ziming. Everyone also noticed the awkwardness between Qin Feifei and Gu Ziming, but didn't know what to say. Qin Feifei's companions merely lowered their heads and quietly ate their dumplings, subtly shifting away from him. Seeing this, Gu Ziming felt a twinge in his heart. What's going on? Little brother, don't you realize you're being isolated? Forget it, I might as well help you out. Thinking this, Gu Ziming took a new cup of dumplings and walked over to Qin Feifei. Hearing someone approaching, Qin Feifei curiously looked up. Inside, he was not as calm as he appeared outwardly. Long before Gu Ziming arrived outside the lab, he had scanned Gu Ziming's RV with his upgraded mechanical mind. He discovered that he couldn't penetrate the scan of Gu Ziming's RV. Not only that, but when the mechanical mind attempted a strong microwave scan, a warning actually came from the RV. Unauthorized scanning without permission is prohibited. Hearing this, Qin Feifei noticed that everyone else seemed oblivious and immediately broke into a cold sweat. This kind of technology was simply unattainable at this stage. Where did Gu Ziming get it? Could it be that he was also a traveler and had similar mechanical mind-like gadgets? The more Qin Feifei thought about it, the more terrified he became. He also knew that Gu Ziming not only had advanced technology, but also possessed extremely powerful abilities. How could he possibly fight against that? For the first time, Qin Feifei had the thought of not confronting him head-on. Thus, he decided to act like an ordinary person who had a disagreement with Gu Ziming. He avoided eating the food Gu Ziming brought and continued his experiments in a corner alone, all to reduce the frequency of contact with Gu Ziming. Qin Feifei didn't believe in the sentiment of old friends meeting with teary eyes. He believed that behind such phrases, there was the principle of stabbing a knife in the back. If Gu Ziming was also a traveler, he didn't dare bet on what Gu Ziming would choose to do once he saw through his true identity. What he could do now was to stop having any contact with Gu Ziming. He heard that Gu Ziming had come this time to recruit Yang Haohan to the northern base. Yang Professor had mentioned this to him after Gu Ziming finished calling him. Of course, Professor Yang wasn't a fool. He picked up on Gu Ziming's intentions to recruit him and discussed it with his newly made sworn brother. Regarding this, Qin Feifei certainly didn't want to fall into Gu Ziming's hands. So Qin Feifei immediately said, "Professor, I think Gu Ziming is just a businessman. Think about it. He made so much money from that special graphene. If it weren't for the zombie mutations, he would probably still be selling it. Why are they recruiting us now? It's obviously to sell tickets for riding in the spaceship once it's built." I must say, this remark from Qin Feifei brought some clarity to Professor Yang. No matter how good the resources provided by Gu Ziming are, or how perfect the ship they create in the future is, if it cannot fulfill his hope of enabling interstellar travel for everyone, then all of it would just be a mirage, like the moon in the water or a reflection in a mirror. It was at this moment that Professor Yang decided to take a closer look. Despite how impressive the biotechnology that Gu Ziming just showcased was, he still harbored some doubts in his heart. "You're Qin Feifei, right?" Gu Ziming approached Qin Feifei, his tone just right, casual yet somewhat cheerful. Qin Feifei nodded but did not speak. "Come on, have some iced tea. Although this lab has protective measures, it's still about 40 degrees in here." As he spoke, Gu Ziming handed over a bowl of tang yuan, sweet rice balls, and added, "Everyone has accepted it. You wouldn't want to be the only special colleague, would you?" Seeing Gu Ziming's words, Qin Feifei's vigilance grew stronger. If Gu Ziming was just coming over to mock him for his poor performance last time, Qin Feifei might still feel somewhat calm. But this Gu Ziming was inscrutable to him. The only thing he could be sure of was that Gu Ziming was definitely not a charitable or gentle person. Watching his colleagues seemingly trying to persuade him to accept Gu Ziming's good intentions, Qin Feifei sighed inwardly, a bunch of fools. In a fit of anger, or even without being angry, someone who could take thousands of lives to establish authority could not possibly be so kind-hearted. The first thing Qin Feifei did after waking up was to thoroughly investigate Gu Ziming, and also discovered the initial unsolved supermarket cases, as well as the information about the disturbances in the estate. Based on this, Qin Feifei deduced that Gu Ziming could also potentially be a traverser. The theft of supermarket supplies and his obviously superior performance compared to others with similar abilities could only be attributed to a traverser. However, he had no evidence and did not dare to openly expose Gu Ziming's identity. Now that they had eaten the food provided by him, how could they refuse if they suggested relocating the lab later? Qin Feifei estimated that this was a case of first courtesy, then military action. After receiving the courtesy, if they didn't heed the advice, then it would be military action. If Gu Ziming knew what Qin Feifei was thinking, he could only sigh and reflect that the ones who understand him best may not be those around him, but could also be his enemies. At that moment, Gu Ziming noticed Qin Feifei's hesitation and directly handed the Tangyuan to his hand. He then patted Qin Feifei on the shoulder and said, "Little brother Qin Feifei, I have great hopes for you. I think you're a true genius. The joke from last time is behind us. If you have time, I can personally teach you how to make graphene." Although Gu Ziming and Qin Feifei were around the same age, Gu Ziming, dressed in a suit, appeared much more mature compared to Qin Feifei, who was in a lab coat. Therefore, when the others heard Gu Ziming's words, they felt nothing out of place. Instead, they thought Gu Ziming was magnanimous, not holding a grudge against Qin Feifei from their previous confrontation. Only Qin Feifei, facing Gu Ziming directly, truly felt the indifference and coldness in Gu Ziming's words. That kind of indifference that disregarded life and death even made him feel that if he didn't do as he said, he would be eliminated immediately. Qin Feifei picked up the Tangyuan Gu Ziming handed over, took a sip, and did not speak. Seeing this, Gu Ziming smiled, and this time it was a genuine smile. He felt that this difficult beginning had been successfully navigated. As long as he presented the chips that these people were hoping for, then the relocation would be a success. Early in the morning, at the laboratory hall. At this time, the sky was already beginning to brighten, and the temperature was about to rise. Most of the researchers in the laboratory had already left work. As everyone was leaving, they took the time to express their gratitude to Gu Ziming once again. In response, Gu Ziming smiled faintly and hinted, "There's even more delicious food waiting for everyone." At this moment, only Professor Yang, his student Xiao Jiang, and Qin Feifei remained in the hall, along with Gu Ziming in front of them. Professor Yang was aware of Gu Ziming's purpose in visiting him this time, so he spoke directly. "Gu Zong, if you're here to persuade me to relocate the laboratory, I can't give you an answer right now, because I haven't yet decided whether to move." Hearing this, Gu Ziming didn't take it to heart. He first checked the data of the three through the villain's eye. Professor Yang's friendliness had reached nearly 80, while his student Xiao Jiang had risen to almost 85, thanks to Gu Ziming's recent affirmation of him. Only Qin Feifei's favorability remained around 0, occasionally fluctuating into negative territory, and Qin Feifei didn't dare to show any displeasure in front of him. "Professor, what are you worried about?" Gu Ziming could see that Professor Yang had concerns, so he directly posed the question without any beating around the bush. As long as he could dispel the thoughts here, others would have to go, whether they wanted to or not. As for Qin Feifei, Gu Ziming estimated he would also follow the majority's decision unless he wanted to go solo or had someone willing to invest in him. If it were 2 months from now, or even a month, if Qin Feifei's reputation spread within the research institute, perhaps someone would come to negotiate with him. However, right now, although Professor Yang had recognized him, and he had gained some respect from people in the research institute, unfortunately, he had just experienced a clown-like self-test. The hard-earned reputation he had built up had suddenly plummeted to the bottom. At the same time, because Qin Feifei was the scapegoat, the ridicule from everyone had become even more intense. Not to mention talent. Even Qin Feifei's character was being questioned by some. For Qin Feifei, all these problems were not an issue. He believed that as long as he could get an opportunity, he would surely be able to slap everyone in the face again. I'm worried. As soon as the words came out, Professor Yang instantly realized he had been led into a trap. He pretended to cough and countered, "Gu Zong, how do you think we should respond to this disaster? Or rather, what is your perspective on this apocalyptic disaster?" Gu Ziming noticed a flicker of struggle in Professor Yang's eyes, while a hint of amusement flashed in Qin Feifei's gaze, revealing the truth behind the situation. Previously, during their interactions, this old man Yang had been quite enthusiastic, not guarded at all. But now, it was evident there was some barrier. It was likely that Qin Feifei had said something bad about him. Although Qin Feifei's smile had come and gone quickly, Gu Ziming believed in his own judgment. Qin Feifei had indeed just smiled. It seemed that Qin Feifei had given some advice to the old man Yang, causing him to waver fundamentally. Why would a tech fanatic waver? He had shown his skills. What else was there? Gu Ziming's mind raced, and he even used a bit of enhanced brain power. Right? Aside from caring about his technology, the tech fanatic was also concerned about the purpose of using that technology. Thinking of this, Gu Ziming found it was a good entry point. It was time to paint a vision for them. Ahem. Gu Ziming cleared his throat and said with a serious expression, "This apocalyptic disaster is caused by solar anomalies. This point is undeniable, right?" The three shook their heads. This had already been expressed by others long ago. Gu Ziming continued, but his tone shifted to a deep, sympathetic state. "This disaster has already claimed the lives of over 99% of people, and I believe this ratio will continue to increase. Because the effects of the solar anomaly have not yet fully manifested. Once the full impact is realized, the entire blue star will face complete destruction. If we can say something, let's hope that all of us who remain can build a massive spacecraft, and before the true apocalypse arrives, we can escape from Blue Star together." At this point, Gu Ziming spoke with clarity and passion, as if he were the embodiment of God, about to save everyone. The few of them were somewhat moved by Gu Ziming's speech. Before they could regain their composure, Gu Ziming continued to drop a bombshell, saying, "I have decided to unite all current forces, including all existing countries outside, to jointly build a spacecraft, and then take all the survivors from Blue Star away." "You mean you want to unite all countries?" Professor Yang asked in disbelief. This idea far exceeded his expectations. He initially thought it would just be to create a national-level spacecraft for Xia country. If they were to create a world-class spacecraft, that would be far grander than his original goal. Of course, the difficulty was also much greater. While Gu Ziming and Professor Yang were discussing worldwide cooperation, only Qin Feifei remained calm. He always felt that Gu Ziming could not possibly have the heart of a universal sage. If Gu Ziming had heard Qin Feifei's thoughts, he would certainly agree. "Little brother, you are absolutely right." Yet, this did not stop Gu Ziming from continuing to paint the vision. "Once our northern-based research institute is set up, I will announce our ideas to the world. At that time, we will also establish a joint research institute to design and manufacture the spacecraft together." This undoubtedly struck a chord with Professor Yang. Creating a savior spacecraft alongside the world's top scientists, whether in terms of technology or significance, far exceeded his imagination. "Great!" Before Qin Feifei could interject, Professor Yang jumped up and shouted. It wasn't that he didn't understand how to remain calm. He was simply too excited. He had previously called for national unity in research and development, but unfortunately, due to a lack of official support, his personal influence did not have a decisive effect. But he believed that this young man in front of him had a way to realize the future blueprint he had just planned. In his life, he had seen countless people. He could tell the difference between true and false calmness and confidence in Gu Ziming's eyes. If they could truly unite the world's forces, he himself was also confident and capable of helping Gu Ziming build a true Noah's Ark. A month has passed in the blink of an eye. It has already been a month since Gu Ziming went to the Research Institute to invite Professor Yang and his team. During this month, Professor Yang and Qin Feifei's laboratory team have moved to the northern base and have been working there for some time. Because Gu Ziming has set living conditions that far exceed those of the previous Research Institute, there is no longer any talk among Professor Yang's team about wanting to return to the Research Institute. Moreover, the symptoms of the Research Institute's internal problems have become increasingly obvious, and many people want to move to the northern base. Not to mention the living conditions, even the laboratory facilities are much better than those they had. However, there are also some research teams from the southern base that support the institute. While they envy the treatment provided by Gu Ziming, they have no intention of relocating. As Gu Ziming has now determined the research direction for the spaceship, whether they want to go there or have already gone, it is all related to this project. Those of them who remain are still focused on geological structure surveys and disaster prevention facilities. Qin Feifei's talk about an impending apocalypse in 3 years lacks substantial evidence, so a considerable number of people have decided to stay on Blue Star. Furthermore, they do not believe that a spaceship capable of carrying all of humanity can be built with the current resources. Despite going through several apocalyptic disasters, with a survival rate of less than 1 in 1,000, and even some impoverished and backward small countries facing total annihilation, there are still nearly 10 million people who have managed to survive. The issues cannot simply be solved by a single spaceship. At the northern base, in the underground laboratory, Ziming is currently discussing plans with Professor Yang and several key technical personnel. Mr. Gu, our four-curve microparticle engine system has been designed. After computer simulations, it can completely accommodate a space for 1 million people. One of the key personnel adjusted his glasses and looked at the simulation results in his hands, saying, "Yes, Mr. Gu, this is thanks to your supercomputer. Its computational speed is simply faster than all the current computers combined." Another technician who was typing on the keyboard chimed in, "Ziming, your research and development abilities are truly genius level, no polymath. It would be a tremendous loss and waste of your scientific talents if you didn't come in." Professor Yang has become more familiar with Ziming these days, so he started calling him by his first name instead of addressing him as Mr. Gu like others. At this moment, Professor Yang's thinning hair has nearly disappeared completely, and his eye bags have become noticeably larger than before. Thanks to Ziming's nutritious meals and supportive working environment, otherwise, with his recent crazy work schedule, he would have collapsed long ago. Since these people arrived, Ziming exchanged 1 million luck points for a quantum computer from the system. This computer is fully loaded in terms of computing power. Based on the computing volume of the people at the northern base, it has not yet reached even 1% of its capacity. The items exchanged with luck points have brought about one effect. Great. Now, the core engine technology for the spaceship has been designed by Professor Yang and Qin Feifei, and the overall model has been largely designed by others. However, the overall framework was created by Ziming himself. After establishing the direction, the other details can be handed over to others for further refinement. Everyone has worked hard. I've decided to give everyone a 2-day break to rest and recover. Ziming looked at the tired faces of the crowd and realized that if things continued like this, it might backfire. So he simply decided to give everyone 2 days off to relax a bit. Next to him, Qin Feifei watched Ziming's somewhat smug expression with some displeasure, but he didn't say anything. After observing for a month, he suddenly realized that Ziming wasn't as detestable as he thought. The reason, he believed, was due to Liu Xiaoxiang, which made him have a more favorable view of Ziming. However, now that he occasionally saw the fully matured Liu Xiaoxiang entering the lab, his heart no longer stirred with any emotions. On the contrary, during this time, he had been working in Professor Yang's lab, and he had developed a strange feeling towards Professor Yang's assistant, Xiao Jiang. This feeling was new to him, but he suspected it wasn't anything serious, so he hadn't acted on it. It was just that sometimes after work he would return to the dormitory with Xiao Jiang. Now that they had come to the northern base, their work and accommodation had been set up in specially designed insulated spaces by Ziming, allowing them to resume their previous routine of working during the day and resting at night. This rhythm was also a tactic used by Ziming to distinguish them from the research institute. As for Qin Feifei's transformation, it was all orchestrated by Ziming. Since the lab was located in the northern base, Liu Xiaoxiang and Qin Feifei had also joined in, helping with some designs for the spacecraft. In fact, Ziming even granted them the highest level of access. However, having his own woman in the lab inevitably meant she would have some contact with Qin Feifei, who was a core team member. So, not wanting to leave things half-done, Ziming decided to implement a form of psychological castration on Qin Feifei, which would only cost a few thousand luck points. Now, Qin Feifei himself hadn't even realized his changes, or rather, he felt that these changes were influenced from within, so he saw no problem with it. "Ziming, we've almost finished the design. When can we start actual production?" Professor Yang didn't exhibit the same joy as others at the news of the break. Instead, he continued to ask Ziming when they could actually start production. Design drawings were just that, drawings. If they didn't lead to actual production, they had no value, and the sense of urgency in his heart only grew. Hearing this, Ziming was already prepared. He glanced at his watch, and a light screen projected in front of him. The content on the screen was an invitation letter, which broadly stated, "Our Summer Kingdom Imperial Research Institute has designed a multi-capacity crewed spacecraft, which can accommodate up to 1 million passengers. We are currently seeking opinions from all Blue Star inhabitants. If you wish to escape Blue Star and seek refuge in the universe, we need everyone to collaborate in production. If interested, please rush to the northern base of our Summer Kingdom for a cooperation discussion." Attached are some design drawings. I will send the email out through all frequency bands of wireless waves and will continue to broadcast it 24 hours a day to ensure that people from all countries can receive it, Gu Ziming said with a faint smile, hitting the enter key. Email after email was sent from the vehicle's launch platform to the entire world. Not long after Gu Ziming sent out the emails, some countries began to receive them. In an instant, all the large survivor bases around the world erupted in excitement. As more and more people received the news released by Gu Ziming, the world began to boil once again. The first to react strongly was the island nation. In Kyoto, at the National Strategic Office, a large conference room was packed with people, predominantly middle-aged and elderly men, all with meticulously combed hair, appearing particularly spirited and composed. The atmosphere of the meeting was divided into two sides, one represented by Prime Minister Watanabe from the ruling party, and the other surprisingly represented by Matsubara Inoue from the opposition. Dressed in a black suit, Prime Minister Watanabe was the first to speak. "Our offshore plan has already begun implementation. There is no need to invest resources to cooperate with Gu Ziming." Indeed, the content of this meeting was how to respond to the message sent by Gu Ziming. As a neighboring country to Xia, they quickly received the news. In contrast, the island nation had already prepared a plan. They intended to send a team of personnel to the western plateau of Xia through large cruise ships to construct a city for the apocalypse. Moreover, various resources had already been gathered and prepared, and the exploration personnel had selected a location. Even before the outbreak of the apocalypse, scientists from the island nation had predicted the melting of the polar ice caps, and it was clear that their island, situated above the ocean, was absolutely unsuitable for survival. Therefore, gold, oil, and food supplies had all been collected early from the civilian sector. Currently, the island nation was implementing military control, with food and other resources being distributed according to plans, maintaining the population at around 400,000 for 2 superbases. One base was responsible for researching methods to cope with the apocalypse while also governing the entire island nation, functioning as the upper base. The other base consisted of robust labor forces dedicated to producing supplies for the city of the apocalypse. They were almost ready to start heading to the western plateau of Xia to kick off their plans when they suddenly received Gu Ziming's invitation, mentioning the construction of a spaceship. According to their scientists' immediate verification, it turned out that constructing such a spaceship was indeed possible. This led those who originally planned to move to the city of the apocalypse to rethink whether the city or the spaceship was safer or more cost-effective. They could not guarantee that they could safely navigate the upcoming series of changes within the city of the apocalypse. If they escaped to space, it would certainly seem safer. After all, they were business people, and the city of the apocalypse was designed and constructed by the military. This group of people knew that if they were in the city of the apocalypse, they would be like lambs waiting to be slaughtered, just as they had previously been forced to hand over resources. Likewise, relying on some connections and military strength, Matsubara Inoue, originally a businessman, gradually became the leader of this group of businessmen, the head of the opposition. Matsubara Inoue looked at the crowd behind him and firmly rebutted Prime Minister Watanabe. "If we as a nation assist Gu Ziming in building the spaceship, then we can also gain qualifications for boarding. At that time, wouldn't going to space be safer than staying on the unknown blue planet? Gu Ziming is a Chinese. Not to mention whether the spaceship plan is correct or not. What if this is a conspiracy to seize our resources? What if he swallows up the materials we contribute and then designs a small spaceship to leave everyone behind? Or even if that Chinese doesn't have any conspiracy, can he really build such a level of spaceship now?" Prime Minister Watanabe asked 3 questions in succession, pinning everyone to their seats. Indeed, They had only verified the feasibility of the spaceship, but when it came time to build it, the troubles encountered could be infinitely more than the current predictions. If there were any issues or troubles in any segment, failing to resolve them would mean wasting their investments. The risk was too great. Countries around the world that are in a similar situation are also facing this problem. They do not believe that Ziming can create a spacecraft capable of carrying millions of people. This exceeds the current technological ceiling. Of course, some countries have awakened scientists or engineers who have enhanced brains, and they possess wisdom that surpasses the current era. However, wisdom is one thing, and actual practical skills are another. To successfully convert knowledge into practice is not as simple as just enhancing one's brain. In the United States, in the Pentagon, there is an underground space that has become a long-term residence for political figures. However, they are constantly searching for a way out. Much like the island nation facing a sea-level crisis, their terrain is not particularly high. Additionally, due to being surrounded by the sea, some supersized storms occasionally strike from the ocean, each time comparable to a nuclear strike. Even nature's great power causes even more destruction. They have unconsciously turned their attention to the western highlands of Xia country. However, their urgent mindset is quite different from that of the island nation. Their strategic depth is still viable, and the bases built in the interior are currently in good condition. There is no sense of a national crisis that would lead them to gamble their lives, and in terms of resources, they are not comparable to the island nation. Thus, they're thinking about betting on both sides. They plan to send people to construct bases in the Western Highlands while also collaborating with Ziming on shipbuilding, allowing them to survive on that front. The president after the outbreak of the apocalypse has resigned in disgrace and has now been replaced by another president, who is said to have a particular understanding of survival in the apocalypse and is particularly reliable. Therefore, in this oppressive apocalyptic environment, to instill more confidence in everyone, he is also known as the Understanding King. President Understanding addressed the scientists attending the meeting. Everyone, do you think it is possible for us to build our own spacecraft? This question suddenly came to mind after Ziming released his information. Previously, no one dared to think about it. Given the current manpower and skill levels, it was fundamentally impossible to build a city-level manned spacecraft. But Ziming has already proven its feasibility, and as the country with the highest technological level before the apocalypse, if they collaborate with Ziming or learn from him, they might really be able to build one for themselves. Mr. Understanding, you don't quite grasp the technology in this area. Given our current level and resources, it would be very difficult to build it. If we must build it, we can only hope to gather the strength of the whole world, which might give us a decent chance, responded a middle-aged man in good spirits and slightly plump. He is the current father of commercial spaceflight in the United States and owns his own commercial space company. Escaping from Blue Star and sending humanity to space for refuge is also his dream. Therefore, he supports the collaboration plan with Ziming. Others also expressed doubts, but he did not care about their opinions. After all, he only needed to convince the Understanding King. Some European countries were similarly skeptical. However, they all reached a common decision: to send people to check out the northern base that Ziming mentioned. If there is indeed hope, they wouldn't mind investing some resources to give it a try. Imperial Capital, Northern Base, Super RV. Ziming had no interest in living in the dormitories arranged by the base. Even though he had successfully produced a large amount of modified graphene and provided the base with a comprehensive thermal insulation coating, the effectiveness was certainly not as good as the Super RV. In the RV's living room, Ziming was having a barbecue and chatting with a group of women. Feifei, how's the project going recently? Ziming took 2 skewers of kidneys from Zhao Xiaoyu and gave her a glance, then asked Qin Feifei. Since he sent out the invitation last time, various countries had also sent some letters. As for those letters that talked about contributing technology to give hope to the world's people, or hoping that Ziming would take them along after he built the spaceship, Ziming had already blocked all of them. These countries neither wanted to contribute materials nor provide manpower. They only wanted to benefit from the success of the spaceship without giving anything in return. Ziming had no intention of wasting time on them. In fact, most of these people did not believe that a spaceship could be built successfully. The reason they sent emails was that if Gu Ziming succeeded, they would have an excuse or a chance to be included, while if he failed, they would lose nothing. Other countries, like the island nation, the United States, and various European countries, although they expressed some skepticism, still indicated their willingness to support and would send people over immediately. Now Gu Ziming was thinking about splitting the spaceship project, with each department responsible for a part, and he would guide the final assembly. Only by doing this could he maximize technical confidentiality. Because all countries wanted to monopolize this technology, though it's unlikely to be fully realized, Gu Ziming didn't want unnecessary complications. Once they got hold of the entire technology, they would no longer be fully committed to cooperating with him. For this split project, Gu Ziming entrusted it to Qin Feifei and Liu Xiaoxiang. It's almost done. I've split the entire spaceship into 95 parts, like the power system, which is divided into launch power, navigation power, and several other subsystems. Qin Feifei understood the implications of Gu Ziming's actions, so she tried to divide the spaceship project into more detailed parts. This way, they could maintain maximum technical confidentiality and find the right professionals to be responsible, reducing redundancy in personnel. Ziming, do you think that so many people will join this project? Liu Xiaoxiang had completely adapted to Gu Ziming's lifestyle over the past few days. She had fully integrated into this big family, regardless of day or night. She was also considered a main person in charge, mainly responsible for the materials of the spaceship, so she had a considerable understanding of the project's complexity. Relying solely on the researchers at the northern base wouldn't be enough. But to truly bring talents from around the world, just the distance alone was a hellish challenge. The extreme high temperatures had made the world's climate increasingly unpredictable. Satellites had discovered that the largest desert in the world had turned into an ocean. A massive storm had completely surrounded the Australian continent. The people inside had no idea what was happening. Communication signals like radios had been cut off by this enormous storm. Not now, but later. Gu Ziming picked up 2 freshly slaughtered lamb skewers, grilling them while seasoning them, speaking unhurriedly. Look at what we're eating? Fresh lamb skewers. Now guess what people in other countries are eating? How much food do they have stored? The apocalyptic level high temperatures made it extremely difficult to preserve supplies. If not for the deaths of many people, a large-scale conflict among survivor bases might have already erupted. It was precisely because many people had died that the remaining supplies barely managed to sustain the living. You mean as long as we release information about supplies, they will continuously come to us? Qin Wanner, Gu Ziming's chief steward, was particularly sensitive to supplies, asking, "Of course, as long as we can provide delicious food to thousands of people, while also offering those in power a glimmer of hope for escape, how could they refuse us?" The reason they sent only a few people over is that they don't believe in this reality yet. Once they discover there really is hope for going to space and living a stable life, do you think they won't go crazy? Gu Ziming already understood these people's temperaments and wasn't worried about them not wanting to invest. No one knew the desperate desires of those in power. If they could sacrifice the resources of an entire country for the sake of one person's complete safety, they would make that choice without hesitation. Now, Gu Ziming wanted to turn the northern base into a dream factory. As long as they entered this factory, he would give everyone a dream of enjoying a wonderful life in the universe. As long as they worked here for 3 years, everyone could go to space and live happily for a lifetime. Once they came, no one would refuse Gu Ziming's proposal. "You make me want to quickly board the spaceship and go live in the universe." Zhao Xiaoyu looked up at the sky, half dreaming and half awake. "Sister Xiaoyu, isn't it good here?" A soft voice sounded. It was Wu Mingming sitting on Zhao Xiaoyu's lap, asking, "As long as Ziming is here, I'm here." Zhao Xiaoyu glanced at Gu Ziming, her face slightly flushed, whispering in Wu Mingming's ear. At that moment, Gu Ziming was not paying attention to the women's playfulness because a notification sound from a communicator suddenly rang. It was Wen Liangong. What was he calling for? It was the middle of the night. Did he not know that Gu Ziming was still on a normal schedule? Late-night barbecues were just an occasional thing for them. Although Gu Ziming felt some confusion, he still answered the call. "Hello, Uncle Wen. What's the matter so late?" "Ziming, there's been an incident. I just received news that the southern base has started fighting." When Liang Gong's tone sounded a bit anxious, but Gu Ziming could still detect some schadenfreude in his voice. Southern base, core conference room. 2 personnel from Gu Ziming's team arrived here after he went north. However, they seemed to have completely transformed into different people, looking dazed, with dark gray patterns appearing on their faces. The black patterns were deep, like black roses blooming from their chests, rising up through their necks, and blossoming on the faces of the 6 individuals. A mechanical synthesized electronic voice sounded. "Remember, once you go outside, forget everything about this place, and then join Gu Ziming's research team. I will only awaken you again when necessary." "Yes," the 6 replied in unison, their voices devoid of any emotion, like puppets. They turned and left, and the rose patterns on their faces gradually faded until they completely disappeared, and their eyes seemed to regain a glimmer of light. Outside, the plaza of the southern base was occasionally filled with the sounds of gunfire, but the 6 did not hesitate and headed straight for the back door of the base. As they left, a woman's phantom suddenly appeared in the empty base, and then the phantom became more solid until a woman dressed in a black rose qipao fully materialized. The woman had an exquisite face, her long hair elegantly styled into a high bun resembling a rose, giving her an exceptionally alluring appearance. At that moment, a wall in the conference room slowly turned, revealing an entrance behind it, which led to a bottomless underground passage. The woman slowly walked down, and lights automatically illuminated on both sides of the passage. The wall behind her slowly turned back to its original position. At the end of the narrow and dark passage was a spacious hall. The hall was empty except for a single table in the center. The woman walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and casually sat down. After a while, several dimly lit passages around the hall emitted soft lights, indicating that someone had entered. "Why is Black Rose here so early today? Are you waiting for me?" A round figure appeared faintly at the entrance of one passage, and the voice was sharp and piercing. "Fozu, you've grown quite daring to tease me today." The woman referred to as Black Rose rested her chin on one hand while gesturing with a small black knife in the other, replying lightly. "It's Buddha, not Fozu," a greasy-faced man said somewhat exasperatedly, and like the woman, he walked toward the table and pulled out a chair to sit down. Although he looked a bit angry, he did not say anything more, but kept twirling a string of white beads in his hand. Soon, 2 more individuals appeared. One was a hunched old man, and the other wore a sun mask reminiscent of a child's drawing. After they sat down, the hunched old man spoke first. "Huang Tu and Baiyang have gone out for other matters and won't be back for a while. Now that we are all here..." The old man's face was waxy yellow, and he coughed a couple of times as he spoke. After finishing his sentence, he took a couple of deep breaths and continued. "Let's talk about your recent situations. It will help this old man understand the outside world." Cough, 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 cough. After speaking, the old man coughed again. "Chief, are you all right?" The Buddha sitting beside him immediately reached out and patted the old man's back, asking eagerly, "I'm fine. You can go first." The old man did not accept the Buddha's concern and brushed aside his chubby right hand coldly. "Hey, I'm just worried about you." The Buddha, unbothered by being brushed off, chuckled and said, "I have no issues here. The Far East base has already been controlled by me. They are now practicing meditation and living in comfort every day." After saying this, he laughed, but his smile was more frightening than compassionate, as his face was so chubby that his features squinted into a few lines. Compared to Mithriya Buddha's hearty laughter, his smile lacked the kindness of Buddhism and instead conveyed an unsettling terror. Recently, some people at the southern base have sensed something is off, but I have already dealt with the unstable factors. However, our neighbor next door has been making quite a stir lately, and there may be many people coming to the capital soon. At this point, the Black Rose woman straightened up, clearly no longer exhibiting the relaxed demeanor she had earlier, and spoke with a hint of seriousness. Before the old man could speak, the man wearing the sun mask, who had not spoken before, suddenly interjected with a hoarse voice, much more masculine than the previous Buddha, saying, "Are you talking about that spaceship project?" After saying this, he ripped off the mask from his face, revealing a gloomy and rainy-looking face. "What spaceship?" The old man furrowed his brows, as if he had never heard of this matter. "They say it's to send all humanity into space for refuge. I heard about it in Siberia." At this, the Buddha interjected, his fine lines on his face widening. He was equally curious about the matter, but he only understood a bit of the surface, so he turned his gaze back to the Black Rose woman, this time without any lewd expression. "This young man is quite extraordinary. As far as I know, he has poached almost everyone from the Research Institute to the northern base. Now our apocalypse city-state plan might be on the verge of collapse." The Black Rose chuckled while covering her mouth, sending out the information she had gathered. However, her next word sent a chill through everyone present. "If we let this Ziming continue to develop, we will undoubtedly lose." Her vision was to head to the western base, to create an ideal city-state without wealth disparity or class oppression, but now the conservatives left in the Research Institute were starting to waver. Ziming had restored communication between the northern base and the Research Institute, and now those young people in the Research Institute were well aware of the previous lives of eating, drinking, and sleeping at the northern base. Even the experimental materials they usually obtained were transported by designated personnel, and they were the designated ones delivering materials to those stubborn old-timers in the Research Institute. This doesn't mean their research skills were subpar or significantly worse. On the contrary, in this harsh work environment, these young people were clearer-headed and more agile in thought than the older generation. But there was no choice. The entire experimental project had limited resources, and manpower was abundant. If they didn't do it, there were plenty of people who would take their place. If they stopped working, there would be no basic living security at the Research Institute. It should be noted that now, aside from these large human gathering places, the wilds were mostly filled with roaming zombies and countless skeletal remains. Now they deeply regretted not having the guts to ask to join when Ziming proposed the relocation. At that time, they thought those who went to the northern base would have it much tougher. After all, the Research Institute's material supply was still provided at officer level. They feared that after going to the northern base, they might just be on the level of ordinary soldiers. Unexpectedly, those who followed Ziming, former colleagues or friends, had even gained weight. Looking at the photos sent by their companions, it was as if a piece of their heart was being cut out and salt was being sprinkled over the wound now and then. Isn't Ziming from Donghai City? How did he end up in the imperial capital? The masked man glanced at the information just sent by the Black Rose, his mask shifting to a misty expression. Is Ziming related to the recent supermarket supply tracking case? The Buddha-like fat man also started examining Ziming's information, but he had never been to Donghai and rarely stayed in the imperial capital. So for him, it was better to directly ask than to speculate. "I suspect his supply sources are related to that cargo tracking case." The Black Rose then sent out the most recent photo of Ziming's convoy arriving in the imperial capital. Continuing, he might also have heavy weapons, such as missiles, installed on this vehicle. At the same time, his abilities are quite strong. His apparent supernatural power is SS level or even SSS level natural Earth manipulation, but he likely has abilities similar to a different space as well. These are all my deductions based on the existing information. In short, we must decide how to deal with this super troublesome Ziming. After hearing Black Rose's introduction, the few people present gained some understanding of this rising figure, Ziming. The old man, who had not spoken for a long time, fixed his gaze on the Black Rose and suddenly said, "This young man is not simple. Pause the current mission. The priority is to determine whether this young man's spaceship plan is reliable." After finishing, the old man even knocked on the table to emphasize its importance. "What if this plan is true? What do we do then?" The Buddha-like man immediately chimed in with a question. "Old D, if Ziming really builds a spaceship, what significance does our existence have?" The Black Rose asked the question that had been stuck in her mind since Gu Ziming announced the spaceship plan. Her ideal was to provide the remaining humanity with a beautiful, bloodless, massacre-free city-state. But if humanity really left Blue Star, who would live in the city-state she built? This question she could not solve herself, so she hoped that the wisest person in her eyes, Old D, could provide her an answer. The old man coughed and remained silent. Instead, the Buddha-like fat man began to answer his own question. Do you think Gu Ziming would really take all of humanity away from Blue Star? In my opinion, he just wants to use the hands of all humanity to build himself a pleasure spaceship. The Buddha-like fat man looked at Gu Ziming's massive vehicle, a glint of greed flashing in his eyes, and a thought emerged in his heart. If this vehicle were his, it would be like a specially crafted pleasure castle, just for him. The masked man said nothing, silently twirling the paintbrush in his hand, his mask shifting back to the original sun motif. Fine, I understand. Anything that stands in the way of our goals is an obstacle. I will personally eliminate this variable. The Black Rose scanned the group, took a deep breath, and slowly said, Old D, I think Rose needs an assistant. How about I join her? The Buddha-like fat man quickly added, No need. You still have important tasks to attend to. The two voices spoke simultaneously. The former was the Black Rose, and the latter was the old man. The Black Rose glanced at the slick Buddha-like fat man and said lightly, When your strength surpasses mine, I can directly hand this mission over to you. Hee, isn't my ability S-level limit right here? How could I possibly compare to your SSS level ability, Rose? The Buddha-like fat man chuckled a few times, shaking his head. All right, Rose, you go ahead and get busy. I still have a bit of personal matters to arrange with the Buddha and the painter. The old man interrupted the Black Rose, who was about to continue speaking, directly giving the dismissal order. Then I'll take my leave. The Black Rose glanced at the three, turned around, a smirk of mockery curling at the corner of her mouth, and then stepped away, strutting out of the dimly lit hall. 3 days later, early morning, Northern Base, inside the Super RV. Gu Ziming was having breakfast while looking at a map of the entire imperial capital and its surroundings, shaking his head. What's wrong? Is breakfast not to your taste? Qin Wanner thought Gu Ziming hadn't eaten well and asked softly. No, the seafood porridge tastes quite nice. How about the seafood supply recently? Should I add some to the warehouse? Gu Ziming put down the tablet he was holding and lifted the bowl to finish it in one gulp. No, our food supply is still very ample. The vegetables I cultivated myself are ready for harvest today. Qin Wanner had become increasingly adept at using her growth abilities. If it weren't for her desire to eat naturally, she could harvest a batch of food every day. Linger, how's the recruitment for the crew going? Gu Ziming generally handled matters in the morning, and the rest of the time he would play ball games with a few of the idle women or go to the lab to motivate Qin Feifei. Qin Feifei had now become his top crew member and had even taken the initiative to be responsible for one of the major sub-projects he had outlined. There are many people willing to sign up, but I still need to conduct further screening here. Feng Linger couldn't stay idle either and was responsible for helping with the recruitment. Yes, he had already begun planning for production. The design of the spaceship was largely complete, but production itself posed a significant challenge. He still had some metal materials at hand, so Gu Ziming planned to set up the factory first. Once production started, he could think of ways to expand later. As long as he detailed the feasibility of this spaceship as much as possible, more and more people would be willing to join in later. The surviving bases that had made it this far all had their own survival rules. At least when it came to materials, they definitely wouldn't be lacking. By bringing out his materials to kick off the project, it was akin to paving the way for others to follow. All right, I looked at the map around the imperial capital, and there are hardly any suitable large factories left. It seems we need to choose a new site for the factory. After Gu Ziming finished speaking, he projected the map he had just looked at onto the holographic screen, indicating for everyone to take a look together. Except for Zhao Xiuyu, who had partied too hard last night and was too exhausted to get up, everyone else looked at Gu Ziming's map. This map was a simplified version of the real-time map, which had been enhanced several times. Now, The range of the portable map had expanded to a radius of about 50 kilometers. It could be said that the entire northern base, along with a small portion of the imperial capital, was within his real-time monitoring range. The other map ranges were stored through continuous spatial jumps and scanning with the portable map, so the details were quite thorough. What do you think? Where should the new production factory be built? Ziming had a few answers in mind, but wanted to test his women, as the subsequent details still needed them to complete. I recently discovered through the observatory at the Research Institute that the sea level has started to rise at an accelerated rate, so we should choose higher ground as much as possible. Qin Feifei pointed out a few nearby hilltops. The sea level had indeed begun to rise more rapidly, which was entirely within Ziming's expectations. In the storyline of Qin Feifei, when he ignited the spaceship to take off, 70% of the entire imperial capital had already been submerged, with only a few higher hilltops remaining above water. This was also one of Qin Feifei's highlight moments. At that time, the production base had been conveniently built on the plains. Qin Feifei had long known that the base would be submerged, so he intentionally used a detachable design during construction. Thus, when everyone was nearing despair, Qin Feifei stepped up, raised his arm, and initiated the relocation plan for the factory. The final confirmed location was Lingling Mountain in the northern part of the imperial capital, at an altitude of 2,000 meters, with a sizable gentle slope on top. Ziming, should we move to the western plateau first? According to Feifei and me, it won't take 5 years before the sea level will completely submerge the entire imperial capital. Lu Xiaoxiang looked at Ziming with some concern. She and Qin Feifei had discussed this yesterday, estimating that at the current rate of sea level rise, it would increase by at least 1 meter per year. And this rate wasn't the fastest. The sea level rise would only accelerate further. So, within 5 years, the imperial capital, or even half of the plains in the Summer Kingdom, could be submerged. As the Level 5 project leader for the Spaceship Initiative, they understood better than anyone the complexity and difficulty of this project. If they hadn't successfully launched before the sea level rose, the difficulty would increase, and the project would likely fail completely. Ziming looked at the other women, who all had worried expressions. Though each of them was powerful in their own right, especially Feng Ling, who specialized in martial abilities and could take on 10 or even 20 at once, they still felt some apprehension when facing the vast forces of nature. Their worry wasn't for their own lives, but for Ziming, fearing that they would no longer be able to live carefree together like they were at that moment. Don't worry. Even if the entire world is submerged and we haven't successfully built the spaceship, we will be fine. Ziming looked at the ultra-luxury cruise ship quietly resting in the space and comforted the women. That cruise ship was his final trump card, or perhaps his last line of defense. Even if the spaceship project failed, they could continue to survive on the cruise ship. However, at that point, Qin Feifei would lose significance. He would be eliminated to gain fortune points, and the system would modify the cruise ship, allowing them to escape into space. But by then, they wouldn't be able to take as many people. They wouldn't be able to build a city anymore. Just as Ziming was discussing the factory location with the women, a phone call rang out. It was when Liangong on the other end saying, "Ziming, the island nation has sent an envoy over." "Is it an envoy from the island nation?" Ziming rhythmically tapped on the table with his fingers, a bit confused as he asked. According to the report from the second subordinate he had dispatched, the island nation's government wasn't particularly concerned about the spaceship situation. Initially, Ziming thought they were not going to waste their resources, but now he didn't expect them to send an envoy over. Yes, they sent the Deputy Minister of Defense of the island nation, Mitsuhashi Makako, and the chief scientist of their space program, Yinjun. When Liang Gong said over the phone, looking at the device in his hand. At that moment, communication with foreign countries only relied on a few satellites and signal towers that hadn't been damaged, so it was easy to determine the authenticity of the call. When are they coming? Ziming continued to inquire. The fact that these two individuals were sent indicated the island nation's attitude. Clearly, there was some intent for cooperation. According to what Qin Feifei and the others said, the capital city was on the verge of being submerged, which meant the island nation was in even more danger. As long as the average elevation of the capital didn't drop, it remained within a safe range. After all, it was backed by the mainland. However, the island nation was different. While some areas appeared to be unaffected, if a massive wave struck, it would clearly no longer be suitable for habitation, even if things returned to normal after the tide receded. Coastal cities in the island nation were not few, and those surviving bases by the sea would need to urgently initiate their plans for island evacuation. Gu Ziming guessed correctly. Several large bases had already suffered attacks from ocean waves, and the Prime Minister had decided to proceed with both the landing and space ascent plans simultaneously. The Ministry of Defense and the Academy of Sciences were deploying elite forces to see if they could collaborate with Gu Ziming on the space program, while civilian tech forces and engineers were heading to the Western Plateau to build the last city. The survey team sent earlier had already returned, having found a suitable flat area for construction. It was expected that they could build an underground city capable of accommodating 1 million people. It is expected to arrive at Jinko tomorrow. If everything goes smoothly, they should reach our northern base the day after tomorrow at dawn. By the way, Ziming, how's your project progressing? When Liangong rarely asked about Gu Ziming's spaceship project, he felt a sense of sadness about this project. He had lived on this land for over half his life and had protected it for just as long. The thought that this land could be lost was something he found hard to accept. He had learned from his earlier chats with Wen Yin that Blue Star was on the brink of destruction. Now, all he could do for Gu Ziming was to manage the soldiers at the northern base. When the time came, Gu Ziming could utilize this force to make a final stand for humanity. Gu Ziming caught the old man's sentiment, but didn't say any comforting words. He simply replied, "The design board has been completed. I'm currently preparing to build a factory and start construction." In this project, when Liangong's leadership at the northern base was indeed a crucial part. Gu Ziming planned to use this group of soldiers as supervisors to oversee the entire production process. A spaceship has a vast capacity, which means the resources and manpower needed are immense. Resources could be managed, but controlling manpower was not that easy. Gu Ziming intended to build 3 parts factories and an overall assembly factory, expecting to invest 400,000 workers into the construction. Without a qualified regulatory agency, those 400,000 workers would be a highly unstable superbomb. Once it exploded, it would result in an irreparable disaster. For this, Gu Ziming had already discussed it with Wen Yin. She had experience as a police officer and a military background, making her the most suitable candidate for the regulatory department's head. In the background, this would also require the efforts of her father, Wen Liangong. Upon hearing this, Wen Liangong knew he would soon have work to do, so he directly connected to the island nation's radio channel and said, "Ziming, this is the communication channel for the island nation. You can answer or respond directly. I need to go get busy now." After finishing the conversation, Wen Liangong hung up the phone. Gu Ziming looked at a segment of code displayed on the screen, the corners of his mouth slightly rising. The next day, Gu Ziming received an urgent message from the island nation, which roughly meant, "We have successfully landed and hope your country will show sincerity by sending someone to pick us up. Please hurry to the northern base. We are currently in a meeting and have no time to carry out the pickup mission." Gu Ziming casually drafted an excuse and sent it back. On the other side at the Jinport dock, inside the hold of an ocean-going ship, Kuji Mitsuhashi said to Shou Yin-jun, "Shou Yin-san, do you think they will come to pick us up?" Beside him, the balding old man Ko said, "Minister Kuji, I bet they will definitely come to pick us up." "Oh, why are you so sure?" Kuji Mitsuhashi put on a specially made thermal suit from the military, the inner lining of which was made from the graphene that Gu Ziming had auctioned off back then. So, he had a bit of understanding about Gu Ziming. He knew Gu Ziming was a very domineering person. What he said was how it was, and he didn't play by the rules. It wouldn't be strange if Gu Ziming sent someone to pick them up since they were guests, but to say for certain, that was another matter. "Minister Kuji, you are not familiar with the environment here in Shabwa. When I came here for inspection and study, I had a convoy sent to pick me up. This is the greatest courtesy that Shabwa values. They will treat outside guests with the highest courtesy." Shou Yin-jun was also wearing a thermal graphene suit, And because he was a bit excited, he had some sweat on his forehead, wiping it while waiting for the radio message. Beep, beep, beep. A message came through. Minister Kuji, what did I say? This should be the reception process being sent to us. Shou Yin Jun hurriedly opened the radio. The information was very clear, and there were no confidential procedures, just within the middle. Please hurry to the northern base. We are currently in a meeting and have no time to carry out the pickup mission. Shou Yin Jun read the radio message word by word, and as he read, his speed slowed down. He then put down the radio, trembling a hand pointing, and said, This. What does this mean? Kuji Mitsuhashi, who didn't quite understand the middle content, looked at Shou Yin Jun's reaction and couldn't help but shake his shoulder and ask, Gu Ziming is being too excessive. After patting his chest and finally calming down, Shou Yin Jun continued, They didn't even send anyone to pick us up. Hearing this, Kuji Mitsuhashi was also a bit stunned and said, Then how are we supposed to get over there? At 3 o'clock the next morning, a convoy arrived at the gates of the northern base. The visitors were the envoys from the island nation, led by Mitsuki Sanzu. Hey, please inform Gu Sang that I have come to cooperate at his invitation. Hui Yanjun had spent some time in the Xia Kingdom, so he stepped forward to negotiate with the guards at the base. Additionally, Mitsuki Sanzu had originally prepared a translator, but due to the severe temperature fluctuations at sea, the translator caught a bad cold and was currently receiving in a car behind them. Mitsuki Sanzu watched as Hui Yanjun and the guard were continuously tugging at each other. His already frayed nerves flared up again. Fortunately, one of his subordinates had thoughtfully prepared 3 spare vehicles. Otherwise, they wouldn't have even made it to the imperial capital. Hey, is this the northern base? We are a research team from the island nation. Hui Yanjun was still explaining their origins to the soldiers, but they showed no reaction. They only adhered to orders from their superiors. If the higher-ups said that irrelevant people could not enter, then they could not enter. Anyone who dared to force their way in would be treated as a zombie. They had also called Gu Ziming for verification, but no one answered on his end. This was not Gu Ziming's fault. After all, he still maintained a habit of sleeping at night. Only at night did he feel alive, and it was also the perfect time to play role-playing games with the ladies. During the day, he was very busy and had no time at all. Beep, beep, beep. Ziming phone. Gu Ziming's favorite role-playing game was the 3 Great Skeleton Spirits. At that moment, he was portraying a monkey hitting the fairies with a stick. Forget it, who calls at night, out of boredom? Gu Ziming scanned his surroundings with a portable map and found nothing unusual. Aside from the few envoys from the island nation at the base gate, everyone else was busy with their own matters. This was the perfect moment to assess the sincerity of the island nation. Applying some pressure now would allow him to better gauge their bottom line later. Thus, there was no need to concern himself with them at the moment. However, a fairy actually dared to act up and had the energy to call him to answer the phone. This was irresponsible behavior and warranted severe punishment. With that, Gu Ziming continued to perform vigorously on stage while the envoys from the island nation and the guards at the gate remained in a standoff. Leave quickly. You are not allowed to linger at the base gate. One of the guard squad leaders looked inside the convoy, noting that there were 6 ability users among them. But still, the strongest one only had an S-class aura. Currently, there were over 40 ability users on duty in the guard squad, with 4 S-class ability users approaching him. So the squad leader remained unperturbed and continued. I'll emphasize again, leave quickly, otherwise you will bear the consequences. Wait. Hui Yanjun waved his hands to indicate that he meant no harm while reassuring Mitsuki Sanzu behind him. Minister Mitsuki, don't panic. This is a misunderstanding. He had noticed that the Deputy Minister of Defense behind him was itching to use force during their earlier argument with the guards. However, Mitsuki Sanzu wasn't foolish enough to think that their small team of about 10 could just barge into such a large survival base. So he simply waved his hand at Hui Yanjun, signaling him to resolve the issue quickly. Hello, soldier. You can tell your superiors that we are here to discuss cooperation at Mr. Gu's invitation. After calming down the people behind him, Hui Yanjun continued to speak to the soldier. The squad leader looked at the few people and indeed felt they didn't resemble those wandering survivors from the apocalypse, so he decided to report to his superiors. He had heard about President Gu's arrangements and thought it would be better to report. 3 minutes later, you will first enter the quarantine area and wait for 72 hours before you can come in. During this period, we will only provide basic food supplies, the squad leader said after finishing the phone call, pointing to an area marked off beside the main entrance. He had just received a notice from his superiors, instructing him to keep them outside for 72 hours before allowing them in. This was actually a directive from Gu Ziming. Although he was playing a game, he still devoted some attention to this matter. By keeping them outside for 3 days, their sunk costs would increase from the start, making them more eager to cooperate with him. When it came time to negotiate terms, he would have more leverage. Because right now was not the time to break relations, he still needed their resource investment. By the time the spaceship was completed, it would not be about negotiating terms anymore, but would instead be about having them at his mercy. At the same time, 3 days was also a waiting period for the envoys from other countries, bringing them together for discussions. He didn't want to convince each one individually, as that would be too time-consuming and labor-intensive. Moreover, people have a herd mentality. Negotiating one-on-one could lead to some countries being unwilling or unable to reach an agreement. If he discussed it all together, he could present a standard proposal that everyone would either accept or reject together, significantly increasing the likelihood that they would agree. As for the so-called zombie testing, that was no big deal for him, a person with the physique of the zombie king. Meanwhile, in a surveillance room, a sneaky figure appeared unnoticed by Gu Ziming. The newcomer was Qin Feifei. After overcoming several challenging problems and gaining Gu Ziming's tacit approval, Qin Feifei, now in the Base Research Institute, had truly gained some power. He had just learned that someone had come from the island nation and they were research collaborators, so he wanted to see what was going on. He had some understanding of Gu Ziming's spaceship production recruitment plan and was responsible for several large segments. Watching a team of islanders on the surveillance screen, a thought suddenly arose in Qin Feifei's mind. What if I secretly unite these outsiders? Then I could drive Gu Ziming out of the spaceship. This thought flashed briefly, but it quickly took hold in Qin Feifei's mind. Initially, after witnessing Gu Ziming's monstrous strength and intelligence, he had planned to concede, work diligently, and let things unfold. However, he never expected Gu Ziming to give him such a golden opportunity. It would not be an exaggeration to call it a heavenly opportunity. Yes, he couldn't defeat Gu Ziming alone, nor could he compete with him. But what if he had a group of the world's top scientists and superpowered individuals? 2 fists are no match for 4 hands, let alone the fact that Gu Ziming, as a superpowered individual, couldn't compare to all the world's top superpowered individuals combined. He believed that Gu Ziming's powers were not the only formidable ones. He had seen several SS-level superpowered individuals at the base, and similarly, foreign countries would have their own strong superpowered individuals coming over. The current group of researchers at the Institute had all been corroded by Gu Ziming's sweet words. He didn't even dare to speak ill of Gu Ziming to his colleagues, let alone unite them to resist him. However, these outsiders would not easily succumb to Gu Ziming. As long as he could unite them, he could also bring Gu Ziming to his knees. The next day, a medical examination team was temporarily stationed in the island nation to conduct a comprehensive health check for Mitsuki Sanshia and his team. After all, when doing work, it's important to cover all bases. At the same time, the duration of the testing was not merely for the sake of detaining a few individuals. Just after the examination concluded, a healthcare worker dressed in a white coat stepped away from the group and quietly stayed behind in the island nation's tent. "Doctor, we should be done with the checkup, right? Is there anything else you need?" asked Hui Yanjun, who was in the same tent as Mitsuki Sanshia, looking puzzled at the doctor who had remained alone. "Nothing much. I just wanted to have a chat with you," a slightly hoarse voice replied as the doctor removed his protective mask, revealing his true face. It was Qin Feifei, who had been inquiring about information the day before. After thinking for a long time, he decided to take the opportunity to speak with the scientists of the island nation ahead of time. If they chose to cooperate, he would certainly have professional interactions with them later. But at that time, there would be too many people around, making it difficult to discuss sensitive matters. Hello, I am Qin Feifei, the inventor and project leader of the four-curve microparticle engine, Qin Feifei said, extending his hand towards the still somewhat stunned Hui Yanjun. The first step was to showcase his value and capabilities so that these two key figures from the island nation would recognize him and he could gain the initiative in the conversation. As the main character, Qin Feifei had this small skill. As for his collaborator, Professor Yang, Qin Feifei believed he was not a person who sought vanity, so he simply did not introduce his partner. Sure enough, when Mitsuki Sanxia and Hui Yanjun heard the title of Qin Feifei as the head of the spacecraft propulsion system, they were taken aback. Chu-san, it's an honor to meet you. Hui Yanjun immediately extended both hands and shook Qin Feifei's hand tightly, speaking with excitement. As a space scientist, he understood the technological significance of that super propulsion engine. Without this engine, he would not believe in the feasibility of the manned spacecraft project. Although Mitsuki Sanxia did not understand the conversation between the two, he sensed an unusual significance from Qin Feifei's demeanor and also stepped forward to greet him. Chu-san, let me introduce you. This is our Deputy Minister of Defense, responsible for managing our country's aerospace resources. Hui Yanjun introduced his superior while explaining Qin Feifei's identity. Hearing this, Mitsuki Sanxiao mistakenly thought that Qin Feifei was a liaison sent by Gu Ziming, and his anger toward Gu Ziming diminished significantly. After all, they had just completed the examination and immediately sent someone to discuss cooperation, which indicated that the previous unreasonable detention was likely a misunderstanding. Chu-san, may I take a detailed look at the design plan for the spacecraft? Or can I have a detailed discussion with General Gu? Mitsuki Sanxia spoke in the island language, but with Hui Yanjun translating in real time, Qin Feifei understood. However, understanding only made Qin Feifei angrier. He clenched his fists and his gaze towards the two became colder, secretly cursing. Gu Ziming, it's him again? How much benefit has Gu Ziming given you to make you so eager to flatter him? The atmosphere in the tent immediately became tense. Hui Yanjun, who was more familiar with the dynamics of the Xia nation, noticed the change in Qin Feifei's mood and began to realize that this Qin Feifei might not have been sent by Gu Ziming after all. So, what was the situation? Did they have different factions within their own country? And was this highly regarded key figure of the propulsion system, Qin Feifei, at odds with the project leader Gu Ziming? Hui Yanjun recalled that Qin Feifei had also stayed behind alone, and quietly so. This already indicated many things. This Qin Feifei is not here to discuss other matters with them. Thinking of this, Hui Yanjun immediately told Koji Mitsuhashi his thoughts. Koji Mitsuhashi is not a fool. Before Hui Yanjun finished speaking, he already understood the context of the situation. With this thought in mind, he couldn't help but smile slightly and said, Chu-san, Gu Ziming didn't answer our call last night. May I ask if there was some situation that delayed him? He said this just to confirm his own thoughts about what relationship Qin Feifei has with Gu Ziming. If he guessed wrong, and they started off by speaking ill of Gu Ziming, wouldn't that be a trouble for themselves? Listening to Hui Yanjun's translation, Qin Feifei smiled lightly and said, My relationship with President Gu is one of cooperation. I provide spaceship engine technology, and he is responsible for finding people to produce it. As for his private affairs, I know nothing about them. This statement had already made clear his relationship with Gu Ziming. Qin Feifei was not afraid of the island nation turning against him. After all, he hadn't said anything particularly damaging, so it was unlikely that Gu Ziming would directly deal with him. In Qin Feifei's view, Gu Ziming is a typical businessman, focusing solely on interests. As long as he still has value to Gu Ziming will always be friendly towards him. Indeed, in Qin Feifei's perspective, Gu Ziming is simply afraid of death, which is why he sponsored the research institute with some materials, hoping that the institute would eventually produce spaceships for him. Greedy and afraid of death, solely profit-driven, is the true nature of Gu Ziming. Listening to this, Koji Mitsuhashi and Hui Yanjun exchanged glances, mutually understanding each other's intentions. Their opportunity was coming. On the other side, inside the Super RV, Gu Ziming looked at the three small dots in the island nation's quarantine zone growing redder and smiled. The fish has taken the bait. He was just thinking about how to eliminate the donkey after the grind was done, and now the opportunity has presented itself. If those friends from the island nation were diligent and cooperative, it would be difficult for him to act. After all, building a spaceship requires establishing a city. If everyone saw him eliminate a batch of obedient subjects, it would be hard for him to remain the leader. Though military force could also suppress, that would take away a lot of the fun. Now, Qin Feifei has handed the knife directly to him. When he decides to strike, it will just depend on his mood. Just as Gu Ziming was using his space power to observe Qin Feifei and the others discussing, Feng Linger suddenly rushed over, her face somewhat serious, saying, "Brother Ming, there's news about the changes in the imperial capital. The few teams that followed us have inquired about some situations, and I thought I should inform you. Also, the two teams that were with us have come over, saying they want to see you." Hearing Feng Linger's report, Gu Ziming's heart was filled with doubts. Previously, when Liang Xiong had told him not to explore the changes in the imperial capital anymore, indicating that the situation was extremely complex and mysterious. But now several teams had found out about it, and those two teams that had been gone for so long had come at this time, right after he announced the recruitment plan for the spaceship. Is there really such a coincidence in the world? Thinking of this, Gu Ziming stood up from the soft sofa and said to Feng Linger, "Where are they? Since that's the case, take me to meet them." North Base, special conference room. Since Gu Ziming has been living in an RV, the housing that when Liang Gong initially arranged for him has now been converted into a special conference room. Of course, this conference room can also be considered Gu Ziming's usual place for contacting and discussing matters with others. At this moment, Chen Gang and 4 other teams have already returned to the base. When Gu Ziming entered, he found that they were all sitting in the special conference room waiting for his arrival. 1, 2, 3, 9, 10. Gu Ziming glanced around and noticed that only 10 people had come. Originally, it was a 15-person team, so it seemed some were missing. Gu Ziming didn't inquire about their circumstances because it wasn't necessary. Who could claim to survive 100% in the apocalypse? Even he himself was preparing to build a spaceship to escape into space, let alone these ordinary people. Despite their special abilities in Gu Ziming's eyes, their strength didn't even rank among the top 10 of the North Base. One could only say that the talent density of a large base like the North Base was far greater than that of local military districts. "Brother Chun, have you discovered anything?" Gu Ziming pulled out the chair at the front and sat down, asking. "Gu, it's a bit complicated." Chen Gang replied softly and then glanced around. "It's fine, just say it. The protection and confidentiality here are very high. Apart from us, no one outside can hear us at all." Gu Ziming nodded inwardly at Chen Gang's cautious measures. It was precisely because of this caution that the Donghai team had not lost a single member. In the other two teams following Gu Ziming, one had lost a member, while among the two teams that had already parted ways with Gu Ziming, one had been completely wiped out, and the other had all its members still alive. "Gu, I suspect the disappearance of the official forces in the capital may be related to a mysterious organization." After saying this, Chen Gang looked at Gu Ziming's expression, then exchanged glances with several team leaders before continuing. "According to our investigation, after the outbreak of the high-temperature disaster, there has been a force pushing for the fragmentation of the capital's power. Then, during the period of ability awakening, that mysterious organization went completely crazy, hiding most of the officials, and since then, there has been no further news. That mysterious organization seems to also have connections with foreign forces. There have been traces of their activities in the northeast." A tall, slender, middle-aged man added. Gu Ziming remembered him. He was Zhang Feng, the team leader who had first stood up to support Qin Gang when there were disagreements among several teams. "Yes, after we left that time, we went to the southern base. People there said that one night, the automatic missiles were launched, and the targets of that strike were kept strictly confidential." The only surviving team leader after Gu Ziming left suddenly stood up to speak. Gu Ziming looked at this fully intact team with some curiosity. It was indeed strange that while one team had been completely wiped out, this team had not lost a single member. Seeing Gu Ziming staring at him, the team leader chuckled nervously, cleared his throat, and said, "Sorry, Gu, we had left on our own and then encountered a zombie frenzy, getting surrounded. It was later that the southern base sent out a team, which saved our lives, and we stayed there to recover until recently." The team leader's name was Chun Yanchun. He was a genuine hulking figure, exuding a somewhat intimidating aura. Now, standing in front of Gu Ziming, he looked like a shy university student, scratching his head awkwardly. "It's fine, as long as you're okay. Are you all healed up now? If not, you can recover here at the North Base. I can pull some strings for you." Gu Ziming smiled and nodded, waving his hand to signal them to sit down. "No problem. Thank you, Gu." Qin Yanchun and two team members stood straight, bowing respectfully to Gu Ziming. "No need for that, just sit. You can stay here from now on." Gu Ziming looked at the three of them, noticing some still unhealed scars on their bodies and faces. Through the real-time map, he saw that their friendliness level was still in a gray state. Neither friendly nor unfriendly, just like strangers. Interesting, their friendliness level even regressed. However, this wasn't the time to dig deeper. Since they chose to come back, they must have had some purpose. Being in the base meant they were under his watchful eye. Whatever they did, he could know clearly, but it would just require a bit more effort on his part. Then, Gu Ziming poured tea from the table for everyone before sitting down again, continuing, "I understand the situation you mentioned. Is there anything else to add?" Seeing that no one else spoke, Qin Gang moved his mouth but didn't continue. "All right, you all go rest for now. The day after tomorrow, I'll find you for further discussions." After saying this, Gu Ziming left the conference room without waiting for their response. The day after tomorrow, representatives from various countries would come here. Things were bound to get complicated. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. During these 2 days in the Summer Kingdom, many representatives from influential forces visited the imperial capital. Among them, the United States even sent their staunch supporter, the head of the commercial space sector, Elon Musk, in person. Gu Ziming was unsure whether Musk genuinely wanted to cooperate or if he was just interested in assessing the feasibility of Gu's spacecraft project. Despite the American delegation being significantly more powerful than the island nation and expressing a desire for an immediate meeting, Gu Ziming still did not meet with these representatives in advance. The European side sent a united team composed of scientists from various European countries and extraordinary individuals, forming a team that rivaled the American Dream exploration team. What surprised Gu Ziming was that the team leader was a man named Jodel, a German. According to Gu Ziming's ability, the Eye of the Villain, this person was a rare SSS-class extraordinary individual with the extremely powerful ability of elemental transformation. Additionally, there were smaller teams from Africa, Australia, South America, and other regions, but their combined numbers did not match those of the United States. However, Gu Ziming understood that countries or forces without any strength could not possibly surpass the storm-ravaged seas and successfully reach the nearest port to the northern base. Gu Ziming scheduled a meeting with everyone at 10 in the morning, which was about the earliest he could get up. The few women around him were becoming increasingly busy. In order to synchronize their work schedules with the base personnel for easier communication, they had already adjusted their working hours to the evening. Gu Ziming, however, continued to follow his previous routine, allowing them to take turns working and resting at night. "Feifei, is the meeting venue arranged?" Gu Ziming asked while having breakfast, turning to Qin Feifei, who was still meticulously applying her makeup. "All set, it's in the production plant," Qin Feifei replied, looking in the mirror and lightly pressing her lips together, as they had cracked a bit the night before, needing some protective cream to heal. In these few days, Gu Ziming wasn't just playing around. He had also been busy with operations at the site chosen for the production plant. Utilizing his earth manipulation ability, he hollowed out half of a mountain and built a dam with the soil around the mountain to prepare for the upcoming waves. The largest production base, which also served as an assembly base, was established in the pit that Gu Ziming had dug. The top of the mountain was covered with a layer of special graphene and other unique insulating materials to block direct sunlight and prevent temperature transfer to the interior of the mountain. Thanks to Gu Ziming's extraordinary ability, the ground was laid with a solid granite base, after which a renovation team was brought in for redesign. As of now, production had not yet commenced inside the mountain. He had merely created the space. The production lines and other facilities still needed to be transported over. The reason Gu Ziming chose this location for the meeting was to send them a signal. This spacecraft project wasn't just talk. It had to be built, and it certainly could be built. This mountain base was the best start. Hearing Qin Feifei's response, Gu Ziming finished his abalone and shark fin porridge in one gulp, wiped his mouth, and said, "It's time to let the world know who the savior is. Follow me." For this meeting, Gu Ziming also planned to bring the women along, as he intended to delegate power to them for managing the entire production project when he wanted to take it easy later. This time, instead of driving to the base's guest house, where the foreign visitors were temporarily staying, he chose a flying car specially designed by Qin Feifei. After all, the production site was still some distance from the northern base, with some mountain roads and ruins in between. Flying over was much more convenient. As for the representatives from various countries, they had already set off the night before, taking advantage of the cooler temperatures to make their way early. Gu Ziming checked the time and figured they had likely been waiting for several hours, but he didn't mind at all. "Feifei, let's go." 30 minutes later, Qin Feifei drove the flying car, bringing Gu Ziming and the others to the production base. There are 4 access passages leading into the production base from the outside, among which the largest is the main entrance passage. This is a tunnel directly excavated from the foot of the mountain, and it is the widest of all the passages, prepared for the transportation of machinery and equipment in the future. However, once the production facilities inside are fully established, this passage will be sealed off to prevent the super tsunami from flooding in. Qin Feifei drove the flying car directly into the tunnel, and inside was a vast and open plaza space. Similarly, those foreign delegations also arrived in specially equipped minibuses, and even the representatives from the island nation drove their own vehicles with special arrangements. Upon seeing a flying car, everyone hurriedly got out. As soon as they entered the plaza, they noticed something extraordinary. The temperature here was surprisingly only around 20 degrees, which is the most comfortable temperature for the human body. The representatives, who hadn't engaged in outdoor activities for a long time, rushed out to run and jump. This was true freedom. Qin Feifei, who entered for the first time, was also shocked. He didn't expect Gu Ziming's strength to be so great that he could create such a vast space within a mountain in this apocalyptic environment. Moreover, according to his mechanical calculations, the efficiency of this mountain structure was unimaginable. It simply did not conform to the laws of physical architecture. Qin Feifei came along with the Research Institute from the northern base to help them adapt to the working environment in advance. When the production equipment was in operation, these engineers or designers would definitely need to personally guide and supervise, so Gu Ziming simply invited them over as well. Qin Feifei noticed Guang Zixiang not far away and slightly averted his gaze to avoid making eye contact with him. Back then, he had painted a grand vision of collaboration for Guang Zixiang, but now he felt quite uncertain. At that time, Guang Zixiang had made exorbitant demands, wanting to take half of the control of the spaceship, which was beyond his authority to decide. In order to bring down Gu Ziming, after much negotiation, he managed to reduce the terms to 1/4 for himself, while the remaining quarters would be divided between the U.S., the European Union, and himself. Guang Zixiang also understood that such a plan could not be accomplished by one country alone, so he ultimately agreed verbally. However, what surprised Qin Feifei was that yesterday, when he sought out the U.S. delegation, Eeks did not meet him at all, but sent a power engine expert to discuss the feasibility of spaceship propulsion with him. And for some reason, whenever Qin Feifei looked at Eeks from a distance, he felt as if he was being completely seen through, as if exposed to X-rays, unable to hide any thoughts or secrets. As for the European Union, they had just arrived yesterday, and he hadn't met a single person before being sent away, completely missing any opportunity for contact. Therefore, making grand plans with the island nation made him feel somewhat guilty, like a thief. The flying car hovered in the center of the plaza, and the skylight opened as Gu Ziming slowly stood up. Everyone's gaze was drawn towards him, as if they were looking up at a deity. "Welcome, everyone. I will select some of you to become our partners in the spaceship project. This is your fortune. It represents that 3 years from now, you will no longer suffer from the high temperatures of this apocalyptic world, nor will you constantly worry about your precious, yet pitiful lives." After speaking, Gu Ziming surprisingly continued to sit down, and it seemed he had no intention of continuing to speak. The representatives from the island nation, Mitsuki Sanzu, sensed a slightly different meaning. "Some of you among us. Does this imply that some of them will not be chosen as partners for cooperation?" Immediately, Mitsuki Sanzu and Yin Jun turned their gazes toward Qin Feifei, who was also looking at Gu Ziming. At this moment, Qin Feifei did not expect Gu Ziming's abrupt action. He originally thought Gu Ziming would slowly explain his high-tech technology and depict the grand blueprint for the spacecraft. However, what he least expected was that Gu Ziming did not seem like someone who was eager for them to participate, but rather high and mighty, like a benefactor bestowing an opportunity upon the crowd below. Seeing Qin Feifei's somewhat twitching expression, Mitsuki Sanzu and Yin Jun understood that Qin Feifei did not appear to be as powerful and influential as he had shown that day. Others also had varying reactions. The representatives who came here had already prepared for simultaneous interpretation, and each person consciously wore a headset to listen to Gu Ziming's speech. Yet they completely did not expect that this Mr. Gu would have no small talk at all and directly state his intention: to choose cooperation partners. Many had come with the thought of taking a look or casually trying it out. After listening, they felt both amused and frustrated. He didn't treat them as partners at all. "We have gone through great hardships to come here just to discuss things with you. But now the main initiator of this project has said only a few words. That's it." The leader of the U.S. delegation, X, also did not expect that Gu Ziming would not mention any specifics at all. It felt like he was announcing something and then providing no follow-up. He had just activated his proud trump card, his super ability, which could read brain waves, which he called X-ray of thought. But even his infallible ability seemed ineffective this time. He could not extract any valid information from Gu Ziming's brain waves. He even doubted whether he had detected Gu Ziming's brain waves at all, or if Gu Ziming was simply not emitting any brain waves. This made him curious, but also increased his wariness of Gu Ziming. On the other hand, the representative from the European Union, Yodalu, behaved quite gentlemanly, dressed in a suit, with a servant beside him holding a wine tray. He picked up half a glass of red wine, took a small sip, and thought very simply. How could he make Gu Ziming choose them as partners for cooperation? Just now, he had observed the materials used in the flying car. There was actually an element he had seen before. That element was constantly pulsating in the car's engine, and he suspected it to be the four-curved microparticle power engine that Gu Ziming mentioned. Therefore, when he saw the flying car enter, all his previous doubts were instantly dispelled. If this technology had indeed been developed by Gu Ziming, then the successful production of this spacecraft would be just a matter of time. It should be noted that the elevation line in Europe is not very high, and many small islands have already been completely submerged. The urgency for the European Union's decision was also imminent. After Gu Ziming announced the completion, the entire base erupted into chaos. Delegations from various countries were intensely discussing whether to stay or if they felt that Gu Ziming was simply testing their patience. Inside a flying car, Qin Wanner had just prepared a cup of black tea, hoping it could help soothe Gu Ziming's throat later. To her surprise, he finished so quickly and returned to the car, prompting her to say, "Is that it? They waited for half the day just to see you. I thought you would speak for at least half an hour." The other women looked over as well. Lu Xiaoxiang flipped through the attendee list and said, "There are about 16 countries or organizations that came this time. Shouldn't we provide a detailed explanation of our project?" "Yes, my family said that these delegations have ample resources. If we can secure all of them, our project can be initiated immediately," Wen Yin added, recalling the information her family had given her, slightly anxious. Gu Ziming felt their urgency and was somewhat moved. After all, these matters should have been his responsibility, yet he had shifted the pressure onto them. Have you heard a saying about the significance of how meetings are conducted? Gu Ziming smiled faintly and asked, "What saying?" Zhao Xiaoyu immediately responded, "In a meeting, you should look at the number of words spoken. The fewer the words, the less speaking there is, which indicates the meeting is more important and more decisive." Gu Ziming opened the transparent glass window and looked at the crowd outside, who were chattering and discussing. Real decisions are always brief and decisive, with no room for further discussion. Either they come in together, investing manpower and resources to construct a spaceship, or they leave and stop being a hindrance here. As for learning, observing, and experimenting, those should not even be considered. In fact, Gu Ziming was also taking a gamble, betting that these people outside still had some understanding of the future development of Blue Star. If Qin Feifei could predict the devastating impact of the sun on Blue Star with a mechanical heart, then at least some of the scientists outside could calculate the possibility of Blue Star's destruction, and that probability was quite high. Of course, if they couldn't even see that, then they had no need to be involved in the spaceship construction project. A spaceship capable of holding 1 million people is essentially a small city. Without some scientific and technological capability, forcing their way in would only cause trouble. Gu Ziming, we need to take another look at your overall design drawings before we can decide whether to get involved. A strange accent in Chinese rose above the noisy square, drawing everyone's attention. The speaker was a slightly tanned man from a South Asian country, a somewhat portly middle-aged figure who stroked his beard as he spoke. He was the deputy head of the South Asian delegation, Rajesh, primarily responsible for diplomatic affairs. Originally, their country planned to build a city at the Western Plateau because it was very close to them, almost adjacent. However, they did not expect Gu Ziming to announce a spaceship project. After some thought, the South Asian leaders decided to send someone to take a look. Ultimately, they hoped to replicate Gu Ziming's design plans as an alternative for constructing their city. Of course, their resources were limited, and they only hoped to build a small spaceship exclusively for the social elite. So, the purpose of their visit this time is not genuinely to help Gu Ziming, but rather to hope for a chance to steal some knowledge. With a shout from the representative of the A3 delegation, the representatives from the U.S. team, the pioneering group from the Beach Nation, also received a signal from Exis and shouted loudly, "General Gu, our Beach Nation's technology is the best in the world. I hope to share the master design blueprints, and we can further modify and improve them." With the backing from Beach, the excited atmosphere at the scene became increasingly tense. Some of those yelling loudly were small countries, but none of the representatives who could truly be considered powerful stood up to speak. They only remained at the back, silently observing the developments. "Ziming, do you want to go out and explain a bit?" Qin Feifei set the car to automatic mode, stepped out of the driver's cabin, and gently massaged his temples from behind. As the person who understood this project the best, Qin Feifei also knew that relying solely on the current resources was insufficient to create the type of city-level spaceship that Gu Ziming envisioned. Thus, a portion of external resources was still needed to complete the project on time and with quality. Don't worry, these people are more afraid of death than anyone else. Every person who arrives here is extremely fearful of apocalyptic disasters. Otherwise, they would never have crossed mountains and rivers to meet me. Now it's time to put some pressure on them to make a choice. Gu Ziming felt the coolness of the temple massage and the softness behind him as he slowly explained. The people who could come to him were actually members of the escape faction in their countries, hoping to board a spaceship to flee from Blue Star and no longer worry about this apocalyptic disaster. The reason they hadn't directly agreed, yet was merely to seek more benefits. For example, the A3 delegation that just jumped out. Even though their national policy was to build an apocalyptic city in the Western Plateau, the high-ranking officials were still terrified and wanted another guarantee for escaping the universe. The pioneering force from the U.S., represented by Beach, actually just wanted to secure the guiding rights for this project for the people behind them. Thinking of this, Gu Ziming opened the cabin door and stepped out again, looking at the gazes of the crowd, and lightly laughed as he said, "Sorry, you two. You have been eliminated." Before the representatives from the A3 and Beach delegations could react, Gu Ziming added, Security personnel, please escort these two delegations back. His voice did not sound loud, but it clearly reached the ears of everyone present, including the fully armed special security soldiers on the periphery. The representatives from the A3 and Beach nations looked at each other, finally understanding Gu Ziming's intention. We have been eliminated? On what basis? Gu Ziming, we spent countless efforts to get here, and we lost more than half of our personnel midway, and you say we are eliminated just like that? The one who jumped out first was still from the A3 delegation, with several team members in floral patterned uniforms jumping up and down. I said, you can leave. What are the security personnel waiting for? Assist them in leaving immediately. At this moment, Gu Ziming's words no longer had the pleasant tone they had before. Instead, they carried a layer of chilling coldness that made people tremble. Get lost first, please. The leader of a security team said this, and a group of security personnel surrounded them. These security personnel were specially selected by Wen Lianggong from the base to be exceptional ability warriors, so they were quite tough when facing these delegations. You Gu Ziming, you better think this through. Our country, Asan, is a neighboring country, and transporting materials is quite convenient. If you really want to eliminate us, then these supplies and transportation routes can be cut off. The head of the Asan delegation saw two security personnel come up to drag them away, and with a flick of his sleeve, he coldly said, "One last minute. After 1 minute, I will explain the situation. If you don't leave by then, you won't need to leave anymore." Gu Ziming pressed a projection button, and a 1-minute countdown was prominently projected in the air above the square. Everyone below could clearly see the countdown in the sky. 59, 58, 57. Some representatives from neutral small countries showed expressions of ridicule, eager to see how these two delegations, one claiming to be the best in Asia and the other claiming to be the best in the universe, would end. They were also relieved that they hadn't jumped in to question immediately. Otherwise, they would have been the ones seen as a joke now. Representatives from a few major powers or influential forces wanted to see what Gu Ziming would do. Would he really keep the Asan and the Mi country vanguard delegation behind? At the same time, they wanted to see Gu Ziming's actual strength. Although they had already conducted a series of intelligence-gathering efforts on Gu Ziming before arriving, those were just documented data. If they could see Gu Ziming's strength in person, it would definitely lead to a more concrete and accurate judgment. It should be noted that the delegations from Asan and Mi country were not weak at all. Some ability users had reported their strengths to their leaders. Asan had an SSS class ability user, while Mi country, although lacking an SSS class user, had 2 SS class ability users. In any current base, that was a considerable trump card. The leader of Mi country glanced at Asan's delegation, but Akuz from the Mi country delegation had already entered his own pickup truck before he looked over. "Boss, should we leave? I suspect Gu Ziming's strength is at least SSS class." One of the staff members in Mi country whispered to the leader, "We're not leaving. I truly don't believe he can take us all down. Moreover, the Mi country delegation is right here. Their strength is far superior to ours. If it really comes down to a critical moment, they will help us." The leader recalled the agreement made with the deputy head of the Mi country delegation before the meeting and felt slightly more at ease. On the other hand, Asan was in a somewhat better position than Mi country. They hadn't originally intended to participate in this project for sure. Their initial goal was just to learn a thing or two. Now that they hadn't managed to learn anything, it was actually within their expectations. The reason they had been so tough in their inquiries earlier was that they had made their last effort. Now that they saw it was futile, they had already decided to withdraw. The Western Plateau was the most important place for them. They were already in a favorable position there and didn't need to create a standoff with Xia country now. "President Gu, I apologize for our earlier intrusion. We are leaving now. If you need any assistance, please feel free to let us know at any time." After saying this, the Asan delegation bowed to Gu Ziming, started their vehicle, and slowly drove away. Inside the car, the head of the Asan delegation kept flipping a golden business card in his hand. This card had suddenly appeared in his palm when he was apologizing, nearly giving him a scare. After all, being sent out as the leader of the delegation shows that he has some depth, so he didn't make a fuss about it. It wasn't until he sat in the car now that he picked up the card to take a look. The card only had the character Gu and a string of numbers. With his experience in telecommunications, he knew this was a communication channel. Looking at the gilded business card, he weighed it in his hand. It felt solid, and as if he thought of something, a slight upward curve appeared at the corner of his mouth. Of course, Gu Ziming wouldn't just hand out his business card to anyone. He had just looked at this leader of the Asan with the eyes of a villain. Goodness, this guy not only had a dark complexion, but an even darker heart. All his skills were about backstabbing, greed, and corruption, with traits of hoarding wealth and valuing life fully maxed out. For such a typical villain role, Gu Ziming could tell at a glance that he could achieve great things. If he smuggled a batch of supplies from Asan to him, he would only need to promise a VIP seat on a spaceship. Isn't that better than enduring the scorching heat of the apocalypse in the West? As for whether he would follow through in the end, that would depend on his mood and how well he got along with him. Watching the Asan delegation leave, the Korean leader was sweating profusely. What was once a comfortably warm plaza now seemed like a powder keg ready to ignite, making everyone feel a bit restless. 10-9-8? As time ticked down, what was once a buzzing conversation fell silent, and everyone looked at the countdown projection in the air. 3, 2, 1, I. The leader of the Korean delegation shouted out the word I, but before he could finish his sentence, it felt like his heart was suddenly squeezed hard, and then he slowly fell backward. The other members of the delegation were the same, including those two skilled individuals who had maximized their abilities. They too felt as if their hearts were squeezed hard. With a sharp pain, they felt nothing at all. What's going on? The Korean delegation can't all be dead, right? How did they die? Just now, it seemed like there was a bit of abnormal energy exploding from their hearts, and then their hearts just exploded. Delegations from various countries began to discuss everything happening before them. Some with strong sensing abilities seemed to have detected the fluctuations of abnormal energy. However, they weren't entirely sure if they had misperceived it because that wave of abnormal energy was too brief, so brief that they barely noticed it. If those people hadn't fallen, and if they hadn't clearly felt their hearts rupture, which corroborated the previous energy fluctuations, they would have thought it was an illusion. At that moment, the people in the hall turned their gazes towards the American delegation, which had remained silent. They all understood who the Koreans were assisting. Unfortunately, it was a pity that the American delegation's Alex had not stepped out of his pickup until the security personnel finished clearing the scene. Only then did Alex slowly emerge. He knew that now was the right time to talk, and as for that little brother, he was merely a pawn to test Gu Ziming's strength. Now, it was Gu Ziming who had the qualifications to cooperate with him, Alex. Everyone, is there any objection? Gu Ziming looked at the group of representatives from the small nation, being dragged out by security like dead dogs before he casually asked. I think it's quite good. The positions on the spaceship are limited, so with fewer people to share, the remaining ones can get a larger share, said a bald, overweight man with a somewhat gloomy smile. The other delegations noticed that this was a small nation with limited power and thus did not express any dissent, instead turning to contemplate his words. Yes, they understood that even if Gu Ziming designed a spaceship capable of carrying millions, it was impossible to take everyone with them. Therefore, at the moment of success, some people would inevitably be left behind. With sufficient construction resources, the fewer participants there were, the better it would be for those who remained. Mr. Gu, please tell us how we can participate in this construction project. I represent the European Union and offer my full support. Yodalu, the head of the European delegation, stood up, his golden hair shining brightly in the eyes of everyone. I represent the United States in the spaceship construction project. Eeks, who had remained silent until now, also made his decision. He felt that the plan set by the Pentagon was no longer suitable for the current situation. As a scientist, he had also recognized the extraordinary nature of Gu Ziming's flying car, and from his observations, this northern base was doing even better than their own base. This better did not mean that the upper echelons were living well. In fact, every major base's upper members were doing well. This better meant that even the lower-level people were living decently. He observed the research institute and the soldiers in the military camps. There was no sign of the numbness or despair associated with apocalyptic times in their eyes. On the contrary, whenever Gu Ziming was mentioned, their eyes sparkled with excitement. What does this indicate? It indicates that they all believed Gu Ziming had the capability to build a spaceship, and the probability of success for this project was extremely high. Once the success rate of this project was established, and if they invested in cooperation at this moment, the returns would also be exceedingly generous. Eeks was not just a scientist, he was also a businessman. This time, he decided to go all in and bet his entire fortune on Gu Ziming's spaceship project. As long as it succeeded, he would not only fulfill his long-held dream of sending humanity into space, but also reap substantial rewards. Thus, he declared his full support without discussing it with the U.S. government first. Seeing that two major powers had announced their cooperation with Gu Ziming, Mitsuki Sanyu decided to temporarily set aside his reservations about Qin Feifei and step up himself. After all, Qin Feifei had proven to be unreliable. I also represent the island nation and fully support Mr. Gu. Mitsuki Sanyu bowed to Gu Ziming, speaking somewhat respectfully. Of course, his claim of representing the island nation was purely rhetorical. He understood that he did not represent the entire island nation, but that did not stop him from expressing some good words. Otherwise, he felt inferior compared to Yodalu and Eeks. Other small nations saw that the major powers had all agreed, so they ceased to ask questions and simply declared their full support. As for the depth of their support, that could only be revealed later. Gu Ziming understood this principle as well, but he was not worried about these people changing their minds halfway. It was still true that those who could come now were all 100% eager to go to space. Even if they could not represent their entire country, they still had some value. Alright, since everyone agrees, let me now talk about the shares. Gu Ziming raised his hand to signal everyone to be quiet and continued. I will adopt the principle of more work, more rewards, more investment, more returns for the distribution. Does everyone have any issues with that? No issues. Good, I plan to build a spaceship that can carry 2 million people. Of course, that's the maximum capacity. The actual number of boarding individuals will be around 1.6 million. This way, we can provide everyone with some living and reproductive space. After all, this is a one-way journey into the unknown. When Gu Ziming announced the capacity of the plan, the delegations from various countries gasped in surprise. Originally, they believed that Gu Ziming's mention of over 10,000 actually meant a maximum of several hundred thousand people, but they never expected it would actually be projected to be 200,000. In fact, even if the actual capacity were 160,000, that number would still far exceed their expectations. As expected, upon hearing 160,000, the representatives from various countries looked somewhat pleased. For the major powers, the more capacity there was, the more they could allocate later. As for the representatives from smaller countries, they thought that with more capacity, they could also get a share. If there were only a few 100,000, they certainly wouldn't have any qualifications to be included at all. Now, with over 100,000, as long as some of it was allocated to them, these elites and their children would have enough to enjoy in the heavens. Listen up, everyone, this is how I will allocate it. I will take out 100,000 to prioritize those engineers, technicians, and their families who participated in the construction of the spacecraft. Gu Ziming scanned the entire venue. As expected, hearing Gu Ziming say this, everyone felt a bit unhappy. In their view, those lowly technicians were merely tools. Tools can be discarded once used. Why bring them along on the spacecraft and waste resources? Especially when it came to bringing their families. Wasn't that even more wasteful? Gu Ziming was aware of what they were thinking, but his goal was not simply to facilitate an interstellar escape. If it were just to escape, he could have already eliminated Qin Feifei and absorbed the fortune value before leaving. The reason he was still painstakingly constructing the spacecraft was solely to complete the kingly rule mission assigned by Yi Han. At the same time, it would also add some color to his future life. If his entire life were to be spent traveling through interstellar space, having a city of 100,000 would help alleviate the loneliness. As for why he needed to include technicians and their families, On one hand, if production took place here, it would undoubtedly involve the greatest number of technicians from the Xia Kingdom, ensuring the future interstellar city retained the familiar Xia Kingdom style. On the other hand, to make the horse run, it does need to eat some grass. Don't be fooled by the coolness of this production base. Once production ramps up, the production conditions of the factories would immediately decline. Because the temperature outside had already begun to approach 80 degrees, air conditioning would become increasingly ineffective as the overall heat continued to rise. Thus, motivating the technicians had to be linked to their own livelihoods and survival. Everyone thought about it and found it acceptable. After all, it was impossible for them to produce anything themselves. Moreover, Gu Ziming had another 60,000 quota, which they believed they could fight for. Sure enough, they soon heard Gu Ziming's distribution plan for the final 60,000 capacity. For the remaining 60,000, I will take out 30,000 for resource contributors. Another 20,000 will be set aside for special contributors as rewards. Lastly, the final 10,000 will belong to me personally. Gu Ziming tapped on the light screen, and a series of data and annotations were projected into the air above the square for everyone's reference. Resource contributors, as the name implies, means that as long as you provide sufficient resources, you don't have to do anything else to receive a quota. Special contributors are those who must perform certain tasks. Only those with special contributions can board the spacecraft. This also sets a threshold for those in power, those with abilities, or those capable individuals. If you don't have resources and don't want to fight, that's also fine. If problems arise, someone must resolve them, whether through power or force. As long as the issue is resolved, they can also board the spacecraft. As for the final 10,000 people, they are reserved for Gu Ziming's personal special guard. Tentatively, this includes personnel from the Donghai and northern bases, while others can be recruited later. Although everyone felt that their share was a bit small, upon careful consideration, it was indeed a relatively reasonable plan. At least their interests could be met. As for those interstellar refugees, the survivors still at various bases, they couldn't rush over to produce anything and had no resources to contribute. Those present, including Gu Ziming, tacitly chose not to mention them. Time flies, and the white horse passes through the gap. At this moment, it has been 3 months since the World Conference. Ziming, another tsunami is coming. When Yen hurriedly ran into Gu Ziming's bedroom, slightly out of breath as she spoke. Yes, the polar glaciers have completely melted, and the sea level has risen nearly 70 meters. Due to the high temperatures, a thick mist now blankets the entire world, rendering it gray and hazy. The rising sea level has not only submerged coastal areas, but more critically, it has triggered frequent super-apocalyptic tsunamis, with waves reaching dozens of stories high becoming a regular occurrence. Sometimes, the waves generated by tsunamis combined with superstorms cover the sky like a giant curtain, instantly turning entire regions into ruins upon their arrival. Notify everyone to close all entrances and exits, and upgrade to Level 1 protective measures. Gu Ziming rubbed his head and slightly sore lower back, feeling a bit more awake as he issued the response measures. Last night, the performance was the Monkey King's defense of the Peach Garden, where the 7 fairies were ordered to come and pick peaches. Gu Ziming had to exert a lot of effort to subdue the 7 fairies, preventing them from picking peaches. Over the past 3 months, Gu Ziming has limited Qin Feifei to just being the director of a mechanical department, which is far from the role of a world-saving hero in the apocalyptic plot, thus earning a significant amount of fortune value. This fortune value has already been exchanged for potential upgrade potions, raising the abilities of the several women to SSS level. Correspondingly, their physical conditions have greatly improved. The once invincible Gu Ziming now finds it somewhat difficult to suppress their wheel battle strategies. Okay, I'll adjust things immediately. Even though Wen Yin seemed a bit weak, she still mustered her spirit and responded, beginning to make adjustments. Due to the outburst of the apocalyptic tsunami, the East Sea has been submerged, and the only part of Gu Ziming's camp that remains above water is Dongshan. However, from time to time, a large wave will wash over, leaving the entire hillside damp. Fortunately, a little over 2.5 months ago, The production base here had already been fully established, and the construction of the spacecraft was on track. Gu Ziming took a cruise ship to the East Sea. Since the East Sea is considered his place of origin, he still hopes to bring Feng Jianjun and the people within his Tianqiong base over. If land transportation is implemented, it would be impossible to transport so many people. Some areas have become genuine zones of terror due to earthquakes, storms, and self-consuming zombies. Ordinary people generally cannot enter these zones, and even if they do, they usually cannot get out. Gu Ziming could, but he didn't want to engage in such meaningless endeavors. Traveling along the coastline by cruise is much more convenient than overland. Moreover, when encountering storms, his abilities can silently resolve the situation without exposing anything. At most, those brought along might think they were just lucky. The EC official relief base still only has nearly 10,000 people left, which is a decrease of 3 months since Gu Ziming left the EC. A portion of the surviving populace brought back has been assigned to the production factory. Other military personnel have been integrated with the northern base and reformatted into a supervisory group for the entire production factory, overseen by Wen Yin, with Feng Jianjun and Wen Lianggong leading together. Bang! A huge wave crashed against the capital's surface, submerging most of the capital, leaving only a few taller buildings standing like broken weeds by a pond. Shut down the dome, close entrances 1, 2, 3, and 4, and raise the protective shield. A command was immediately issued to the 4 production bases. Following that, the outer shell of the base automatically closed. This was the largest and originally the only production base. In the hardware manufacturing department, Island Nation Research Group, Zhuyanjun heard the sound of machinery operating outside the base and couldn't help but sigh slightly. He would never be able to see the cherry blossoms of his hometown again. Brother Zhuyan, what's wrong lately? As he was patrolling, Qin Feifei noticed Zhuyanjun's somewhat dejected expression and walked over to ask. Since being severely deceived by Gu Ziming 3 years ago, Qin Feifei had decided to remain undercover and gradually gain Gu Ziming's trust first. After 3 years of enduring and gathering strength, he believed he had achieved some results. He had now worked his way up to the position of director of the machinery department, a position that held real power over all mechanical equipment. Gu Ziming certainly knew how important this position was, as the machinery department was responsible for all hardware production. It not only required continuous technical support, but also needed to constantly request resources from various countries. Fortunately, Qin Feifei had a heart for machinery, so the technical aspect was completely manageable. However, requesting resources from various countries was undoubtedly a difficult task. It should be known that constructing a spacecraft of a 10,000-ton level required astronomical amounts of resources. Several tons of raw materials were hardly enough to fill a gap. Just the production of the spacecraft's intelligent chips and circuit boards alone consumed over a ton of gold, and the high-purity silicon was only obtainable because Gu Ziming built a wafer factory to meet the demand. All those negotiations with foreigners were left for Qin Feifei to handle. It must be said, as expected of a protagonist-level character, Qin Feifei had managed to extract a substantial amount of resources over the past 3 years from those delegations that claimed they had no resources at all. Brother Chu, there have been an increasing number of tsunamis lately, and I'm worried about our island nation. Zhuyanjun put down his computer and followed Qin Feifei to a smoking area. He, who originally didn't smoke, had also started smoking now. Don't worry. Do you remember what I said? As long as Gu Ziming is in charge, I will immediately allocate 300,000 spots on the ships for your island nation. Qin Feifei glanced to the left, took a deep drag from his cigarette, and spoke softly. Of course, I haven't forgotten. This is also one of the conditions for our island nation to continue investing. Zhuyanjun slightly closed his eyes, enjoying the stimulation from the high-grade cigarette, feeling a bit emotional. Truly, only talented individuals could acquire such resources. Seeing Zhuyanjun's expression, Qin Feifei's mouth curled up slightly, but he inwardly cursed. This little island nation is even greedier than the U.S. They want a spot for every 300% of resources put in by others. You think just because you're a small island nation, you're something special? At the moment we create the spacecraft, the first to be kicked out of the alliance will be you. On the other hand, Zhu Yanjun, apart from missing the cherry blossoms of his hometown, was also contemplating the secret mission assigned to him by the Emperor to unite the U.S. and European delegations to seize control of the spacecraft. The Emperor had already discussed this with the powers that be in the Pentagon and Europe. The spaceship would adopt a tripartite structure, with their island nation accounting for 20%. Zhu Yanjun could only engage with the hardware aspect. Software and deeper control systems were not under their responsibility. And if it was just about controlling the hardware, it would at most lead to a situation where both sides would suffer, making it fundamentally impossible to seize control from Ziming. The difficulty of this mission could be described as extremely high. In the northern base inside a supercar, Ziming looked at the projected images of each scanned spaceship part and silently began his calculations in his mind. The ship assembly design is set on a plain in the northern part of the imperial capital. Surrounding it are mountains that shield against the attacks of giant waves, and due to the higher altitude, there's no need to worry about flooding. The materials for the spaceship are all heat-resistant, so the assembly base is set up outdoors. This places higher demands on the assembly workers. Although most of the construction occurs at night and measures have been taken to prevent heat exhaustion, it's still not a job for just anyone. This location was provided to him by the southern base, and they also sent a large number of superpowered individuals to help with the assembly. Thinking back to that scene at the time still left him puzzled. What are you here for? A year ago, Ziming asked the suddenly appearing woman. Of course, if it weren't for the fact that he noticed her high level of affection towards him, he wouldn't have even bothered to ask. The leader was an alluring woman dressed in a pure black dress, with a rose-like pattern on her face that captivated onlookers. She leaned in close to Ziming's ear and whispered, "I have just one request. I need 5,000 crew members for the spaceship." While Ziming was busy producing the spacecraft, this mysterious organization was continuously keeping an eye on the situation. At the World Conference 3 years ago, there was a small country's delegation sent by them, who supported Ziming at the time. After 2 years of production, they completely abandoned their construction work in the Western Plateau and shifted their full support to Ziming. The 5,000 quota proposed by the Black Rose, combined with the quota from that small country's delegation and the assembly workers, had already approached nearly 100,000. Ziming didn't mind. This organization had already been thoroughly investigated when those 3 survey teams returned. They were previously a superpower organization that teamed up to build the last city on the Western Plateau. He never expected they would also appear at the World Conference as a representative of a country. With a mindset of, if it's free, take it, he accepted all investment collaborations equally, as long as they didn't cause trouble later. This mysterious organization had also been very supportive, honestly contributing resources and assembly parts and tools. However, he didn't expect that just as they were about to form up, they would need to add another layer of registration. But this also saved him the trouble of organizing, so he accepted their good intentions. Now that they had already formed up, they were in the final debugging phase. Ziming assigned this debugging work to Qin Feifei and her team. The spaceship's control system was exchanged from the system mall using nearly 10 million energy points and included quantum-level artificial intelligence calculations. Ziming named the entire control system Alice, which he shortened to Xiao AI. Now, Xiao AI was continuously scanning every part of the spaceship, marking any non-compliant or suspicious areas with red indicators. Ziming looked at the red marks on the screen and sneered, "Oomph, these people really are relentless." At the production base, in the Joint Research Institute, at this moment, several heads of large delegations gathered together. The only person who wasn't from a foreign delegation was a young man in his 20s, Qin Feifei. "Everyone, I just received news that Ziming is testing the spaceship. You're not planning for the restrictive devices you designed to be detected, are you?" Among the white-haired, pot-bellied middle-aged individuals, Qin Feifei seemed somewhat out of place, but his commanding tone made everyone wary of underestimating him. Originally, Qin Feifei had already designed a set of control restriction systems, but these foreign delegations were uneasy about handing over the entire system to him. As it turned out in the end, Each person quietly set up some obstacles in their respective areas that they had designed themselves. Once these obstacles were triggered, the entire spaceship system would be restricted. No problem. Although I can't design the entire control system for the spaceship, it's still no issue to hinder the system's operation, said an elderly man with gray hair. He was a top cybersecurity expert from America, and to design such an obstacle, he had secluded himself for 2 months, creating a super virus hidden within the hardware. Once someone from the outside activated the hardware switch, the super virus would invade the linked network, indirectly affecting the control of the ship's master. The other representatives nodded, indicating that they had also installed some control switches. Great, now we have our final countermeasure. Although Qin Feifei looked down on these so-called experts, he still needed them to confront Gu Ziming for the time being. Brother Chu, can we confront the Gu family now? Asked the shortest among them, Guang Ci Sanxiang, with a somewhat gloomy expression. He had communicated with America again yesterday, and those white soldiers had even reduced their originally agreed share by half. He reported this result to the island nation's government, which had already built an underground city in the Western Highlands, and inevitably received a scolding. But the most important thing now was not to fall out with America and Qin Feifei. It was to force Gu Ziming out of power first. Once Gu Ziming was ousted, he decided to take advantage of the chaos to launch a surprise attack, taking down America and Europe completely. Our island nation will be number one. I'll think about it, Qin Feifei said as he walked, recalling every detail about Gu Ziming. In his view, Gu Ziming was nothing but a good-for-nothing who relied on others to thrive. The entire spaceship project was upheld by his several women. He believed that with their current strength, they could push Gu Ziming out, but the million workers remained a significant variable. To motivate the workers, Gu Ziming had already announced benefits allowing them to board the spaceship on the very first day of work. If they were to oust Gu Ziming now, those workers would not take it lightly. What will happen to those workers if we get rid of Gu Ziming now? This concern was not only on Qin Feifei's mind, but also on the head of the European delegation, Yodelu, who furrowed his brows and said. He wasn't particularly eager to eliminate Gu Ziming, but as part of the foreign delegation, he had already decided on his camp from the beginning, with no choice but to stick with this group. If we spread the news that we are about to leave Blue Star, what do you think they will do? Suddenly, a strategic advisor from an American skyscraper proposed. You mean let those survivors fight against Gu Ziming first, and then we take advantage of the situation? Yin Jun, who had come to the northern base for the 3rd time, had gained a deep understanding of summer culture and immediately grasped the true meaning of this proposal. Once the others heard Yin Jun's detailed explanation, they also understood this method. Indeed, if they let Gu Ziming and other forces exhaust each other first, their subsequent actions would be much easier. Moreover, they could take advantage of this perhaps being the last war on Blue Star to gain one final war profit. Thinking about this, everyone present raised their hands in agreement. According to reports, the Xia country is about to abandon all of humanity and escape into space. This escape event was initiated by the chief planner of the spacecraft, Gu Ziming. In the previous 3 years, the continuous resource plundering incidents were instigated by Gu Ziming, intending to load all existing resources on Blue Star onto the escaped spaceship. Currently, the spacecraft has already completed assembly, and Gu Ziming, along with a portion of the personnel, is expected to completely flee Blue Star in less than 3 months. Ziming, look at this. I recently received international news through the radio, when Liang Gong placed a stack of printed documents on the table. These documents clearly exposed the spacecraft plan and even incited discord. Gu Ziming glanced at the documents and snorted coldly. What do these little tricks matter? The plan for the spaceship's long voyage was decided a long time ago. Inviting them to participate was just a sign of my own disbelief. However, I heard that those powerful figures, in order to gather enough resources, have initiated one plundering war after another. Our plan has a poor reputation among the common people. When Liang Gong then took out a list of resources, detailing the cooperative resources from various countries or organizations over the past 3 years. Don't forget, we have offered shares of the spaceship's capacity in return. As for those bases that were plundered, if they want to blame anyone, they can only blame those who robbed them. They should be angry at the robbers for not giving them a chance to board the spaceship. Gu Ziming did not look at the materials anymore. He picked up a cup of fragrant black tea and quietly savored it. In the end times, it's a survival of the fittest. If they don't even understand the most basic rules of survival, then the so-called resentment of being robbed is just a matter of time. However, this time the commotion is a bit too big, and whether it happens early or late, it just happens to erupt while he's assembling the spaceship. These matters have been ongoing for 3 years, and Gu Ziming is not unaware of it. After all, those delegations are plundering on their own territories, and the ultimate beneficiaries are still themselves, so it would be easier to just turn a blind eye. A sudden outbreak now, without a few major forces behind it stirring the pot, Gu Ziming would definitely not believe it. Ziming, what should we do? Should we arrange for people to eliminate the hidden dangers in time? When Liangong has been part of Gu Ziming's supervisory team for 3 years now, and his temperament has changed a bit. With millions of workers and several super large production bases in operation, it is impossible for there not to be some sneaky tricks or unscrupulous people involved. Survivors of the end times, few are good people. Who doesn't have a few lives on their hands? They wouldn't dare to say they came to participate in production recruitment. Only those strong enough and in good health can be recruited by the production factories, and to maintain their health, the first thing they need is food. Not to mention eating well, at least they can't be hungry for long periods. Where can food be easily obtained in the end times? Only through plunder and killing, or by contributing some merits to the base, can they be allocated enough food. With these characteristics and enough numbers, managing them is not that easy. When Liangong handled things more gently, but as a veteran who has been on the battlefield, he understood the principle that kindness doesn't win battles. When encountering troublemakers, they must be dealt with directly, and the small signs of trouble must be extinguished immediately to suppress these bloodthirsty individuals. No need. Let the bullets fly for a while longer. Gu Ziming looked at the map on his person, at several red dots around the research institute, and secretly sneered. Qin Feifei, oh Qin Feifei, you have really done me a great favor. I was worried about how to get rid of people, and you immediately delivered them to me. At the research institute, in the conference room. This is considered the highest level conference room in the research institute, and the people sitting here are all the heads of various delegations. Qin Feifei looked around and noticed that the head of the European Union, Yuedel, had not yet arrived. Checking the time, it had already been 10 minutes past the agreed time. Yuedel went back to the headquarters for a visit, so he might not be back yet. A representative who was closer to Yuedel said, "Then let's not wait for him. I'll ask how prepared everyone is." Qin Feifei took the central seat at the front, tapped the table, and asked, "The island nation is already prepared. They are currently rushing from the Western Plateau and are expected to arrive in the capital in 3 days." Just then, San Xiang, seeing that no one was speaking, took the lead and said, "Our country has dispatched 20 warships, and they will also arrive within 3 days." Although X was disdainful of using such petty tricks, the decision-making power still lay with Wang, so he could only follow the strategic plan of the Pentagon. "We in Australia are also prepared. So are we." Seeing everyone's responses, Qin Feifei finally felt a bit more confident. These days he had been pressured too much by Gu Ziming, leading to problems with his mental state. Recently, he was discovered by Professor Yang for having an unusual interaction with his disciple, and he became furious, directly eliminating the professor. Although Gu Ziming didn't care afterward, since then, everyone in the research institute has silently distanced themselves from him. Now, he was essentially the only outcast in this meeting, and this feeling made him very uncomfortable. Only by eliminating Gu Ziming and seizing the sole control of the spaceship could he, Qin Feifei, regain the respect and worship of everyone. Then, we will formally force Gu Ziming to step down in 3 days. Qin Feifei slammed his hand on the table, as if he were gambling everything on the table. PT. According to reports, the Xia Kingdom is about to abandon all of humanity and flee into space. This escape event was initiated by the chief planner of the spacecraft, Gu Ziming. In the past 3 consecutive years, all the resource plundering incidents were instigated by Gu Ziming, indicating that he plans to load all existing resources on Blue Star onto the escape spacecraft. Currently, the spacecraft assembly has been completed, and Gu Ziming, along with a portion of the personnel, is expected to completely flee Blue Star in less than 3 months. Ziming, take a look at this. I recently received international news through the radio, when Liang Gong said, as he placed a stack of printed documents on the table. These documents clearly expose the spacecraft plan and incited further discord. Gu Ziming glanced at the documents and snorted coldly. What do these little tricks have to do with us? The long-range flight plan was already decided a long time ago. The reason we involved them was simply out of doubt in ourselves. However, I've heard that those in power launched one plundering war after another just to gather enough resources for themselves. Our plan has a rather poor reputation among the grassroots. When Liang Gong replied, pulling out a list of resources that detailed the cooperative supplies from various countries or organizations over the past 3 years. Don't forget, we've offered a share of the spacecraft's capacity in return. As for those bases that were plundered, if they harbor resentment, it's only against those who robbed them, not against us for not giving them a chance to board the spacecraft. Gu Ziming didn't look at the materials any longer. He picked up a cup of fragrant black tea and quietly savored it. In the end times, it was a survival of the fittest. If one couldn't even understand the most basic laws of survival, those so-called resentments against being robbed were just a matter of time. However, the current situation was a bit too conspicuous, and whether it was early or late, it just happened to break out when he was assembling the spacecraft. These matters had already been ongoing for 3 years, and Gu Ziming was not unaware of it. After all, those delegations were looting on their respective territories, and the ultimate beneficiaries were still themselves, so he simply turned a blind eye to it. Now that the situation was erupting, Gu Ziming absolutely would not believe it was without the instigation of several major forces behind the scenes. Ziming, what should we do? Should we arrange for someone to eliminate the hidden dangers in time? When Liang Gong, who had been part of the supervision team for 3 years under Gu Ziming, had also undergone some changes in temperament. With millions of workers and several super-large production bases in operation, it was impossible for there not to be some deceitful and rogue elements involved. Survivors of the end times, few of whom were truly kind-hearted, had blood on their hands. Who could say they had come to participate in production recruitment without having taken lives? Only the strong and physically capable could gain admission to the production factories, and to maintain their health, the first thing was to eat. It was not enough to just eat adequately. They certainly couldn't be hungry for long. In the end times, food was not easily obtainable. Only through plunder and killing, along with some contributions from the bases, could they secure enough food. With these characteristics, managing an adequate number was not that easy. When Liang Gong managed it more gently, but as a veteran who had seen battle, he understood the principle that mercy does not win wars. When trouble arose, the best course was to eliminate it directly, nipping any signs of unrest in the bud. This was how to suppress these bloodthirsty individuals. No need. Let the bullets fly for a while longer. Gu Ziming looked at a few red dots on the map he carried, indicating the research institute's location, and secretly scoffed. Qin Feifei, oh Qin Feifei, you have really done me a great favor. I was just worried about how to drive people off the bus, and you delivered them to me. In the research institute, in the conference room, this was considered the highest level conference room of the research institute, where the heads of various delegations were seated. Qin Feifei looked around and noticed that the European Union representative, Yodalu, had not yet arrived. He glanced at his watch, realizing that 10 minutes had already passed since the agreed time. Yodalu returned to headquarters briefly, so he might not have made it back yet, said a representative who was closer to Yodalu. Well, we won't wait for him. Let me ask how prepared everyone is. Qin Feifei said, taking the central seat at the front, tapping the table as he inquired. The island nation is ready. They are currently on their way from the Western Plateau and are expected to arrive in the capital in 3 days. Just then, San Xiang took the initiative to speak up since no one else was talking. Our country has dispatched 20 ships. We'll also arrive in at most 3 days. Although Exus looked down on using such small tactics, he knew that the decision-making power was still in the hands of the White House, so he could only go along with the Pentagon's strategic plans. We in Australia are ready too. So are we. Seeing the reactions of the crowd, Qin Feifei finally felt a bit more confident. He had been under immense pressure from Gu Ziming lately, leading to issues with his mental state. Recently, when that Professor Yang discovered something unusual with his disciple, he was furious and directly eliminated the professor. Although Gu Ziming had not expressed any intention to retaliate, ever since that incident, everyone in the research institute had silently distanced themselves from him. Now he considered himself to be the only loner in this meeting, which made him feel quite uncomfortable. Only by eliminating Gu Ziming and seizing the sole control of the spacecraft could Qin Feifei regain the respect and reverence of everyone. Then, we will officially force Gu Ziming to step down 3 days from now. Qin Feifei slammed his hand on the table, as if he were betting all his chips on a single gamble. 3 days later, Gu Ziming had completed the final testing and debugging program for the spacecraft, and it was ready to ignite and take off at any moment. Notify everyone that starting today, personnel will be arranged to board the ship in succession. 1 week from now, we will officially set sail. Gu Ziming said calmly while looking at the final report from Xiao AI. The spacecraft had already been fully charged. It only needed the final mechanical activation to start the 4-curve particle engine and ascend for a long journey. The energy was sufficient for the spacecraft to fly for nearly 1,000 years. If 1,000 years later he still hadn't found a suitable habitable planet or alternative solution, there would be no need to continue the voyage. Do we need to notify the delegation? Qin Feifei asked, having already noticed the conspiracy behind those people, wondering whether to abandon them and leave quietly on her own. Go ahead and notify them, Gu Ziming said, playfully pinching Qin Feifei's nose and adding with a smile. Do you think they are fools? With so many of us boarding, they will definitely know. It's better to directly notify them and let them choose whether to live or die. Hey, we've been married for a while, and you still treat me like a little girl. Qin Feifei wrinkled her nose, which had just been pinched, rolling her eyes slightly. What? Are you tired of it? Not tired. I just want to be a mom. Qin Feifei gently touched her belly and said softly, All right, once we get on the spacecraft, I'll make sure to satisfy your wish every day. Gu Ziming looked at the increasingly fuller and rounder Qin Feifei, reminiscing about the moment he first met her. Back then, she was a slightly thin female student, regarded by Lin Fan as a goddess high up in the clouds. But now she had become a woman full of charm. One can only say that time is a great author. It gives everyone their own perfect answer. How shameless! Xiaoyu and the others are still waiting. I'm going to notify them, Qin Feifei said, feeling her cheeks warm, and hurriedly ran out of the RV. After Qin Feifei left, the few women in the living room quickly surrounded Gu Ziming, playfully teasing him. Zhao Xiaoyu even pouted and said, I want to be a mom too. In Jinkong, on a high-rise building. Do you think President Gu will go easy on these people? Hard to say. Have you forgotten about the Dongshan riot? It shouldn't be the same, right? This time it's over 1 million people, not just a few thousand. To this day, I still can't forget what President Gu said back then. Good night. That single good night sent everyone in the square into the ground. True, I think President Gu did nothing wrong. If I had the ability, I would sink these people straight into the sea. 2 security personnel were monitoring the situation here. At the same time, there were dozens of surveillance points scattered around the imperial capital. They were among the first security personnel recruited by Gu Ziming into the Gu family's estate, and after more than 3 years of training, they had become quite competent supernatural beings. Gu Ziming had also given them a spatial transfer stone to enable them to teleport over certain distances. When Gu Ziming learned that Qin Feifei and others were secretly plotting, he sent them out with only one task: monitor the appearance of large crowds. After lying in wait for 3 days, they finally discovered a gathering of people around the imperial capital, and they had already reported the intelligence to Gu Ziming. Gu Ziming looked at the densely packed red dots on his portable map, feeling absolutely unfazed. He initially thought these people might be neutral, but he feared they could be a gathering of zombies, so he specifically sent real people to monitor. However, it appeared he had underestimated the situation. After all, they had come across the ocean to see him. How could they possibly be neutral? But that was fine. It would be even more exhilarating to kill them later. Qin Feifei stood on the deck of a ship at Jinkong, filled with boundless ambition. Everyone, as long as we force Gu Ziming down from his position, I promise to distribute the entire capacity of that 1 million to you. Qin Feifei shouted loudly into a megaphone. Although the ships communicated via radio, he still felt that using the megaphone to issue commands was more impactful. In the ship's cockpit, just now Gu Ziming notified us to board. I received it too. They notified us that our island nation should board within 7 days. Same here. Should we? We still have one last chance to choose. A representative from a small country finally mustered the courage to express his opinion to a few big shots. Are you saying we should give up? Guangxi Senyu turned his head and asked lightly. No, I just think we should be more cautious. The small representative wiped the virtual sweat from his forehead and chuckled awkwardly. There's an old saying in Xia country. Once the arrow is loosed, there's no turning back. We can't go back now. Hui Yanjun looked at the overall gathering situation and pointed at the display, saying, right now, everyone except the Udalu people has already reached their expected positions. That fool must be scared. X, who had been silent, sneered and mocked. Could it be that? It won't happen. We have set up reconnaissance troops around the imperial capital. That guy, Udalu, has brought no one at all. Besides, do you think he would dare to inform Gu Ziming? His previous actions have left no traces. X replied again, then spat in the direction of Europe. Since the second year, he had been unable to understand the inner thoughts of that Udalu, which seemed like an increasingly thick fog. This was also a reason he disliked that guy, just like Gu Ziming. Enough about him. The show is about to start. Everyone nodded and left the cockpit, heading to the deck. After 3 years of technology, even some ordinary people could withstand the extreme temperatures and sunlight. Let's get started. Qin Feifei looked at the few people who had appeared on the deck, nodded, and then called Gu Ziming's communication frequency, saying, "Human rights are equal. I want to survive. Human rights are equal. I want to survive." A hoarse shout rang out from the mouths of countless people. This sound quickly transmitted via radio waves to the broadcast of the Northern Base Research Institute and echoed throughout the entire base. Gu Ziming, inside the RV, poured himself a glass of red wine, stood by the window, silently watching as the base began to descend into chaos. What should we do? Should we cut off the signal? Lu Xiaoxiang called up the radar monitoring, which displayed a dense cluster of signal sources near Jinkong. No, let the bullets fly a little longer, and let those about to board the ship see how many people dream of the opportunity one am giving them to board. Gu Ziming shook his head and said while savoring the fragrant wine in his mouth. Deep inside, he was already starting to feel restless. The bloodline of the zombie king he had copied from Wu Tian was calling out with desire. Gu Ziming glanced at the portable map, where nearly 1 million dots were displayed. If he could devour the blood of these people, the zombie king would evolve to the peak state of the plot of Wu Tian. At that time, he would no longer be the zombie king. He would truly be a god. Gu Xianzong, we just want to obtain the right to survive. We don't want to be abandoned on Blue Star like this. We know that you have already built the spacecraft, and the materials you used to build the ship were taken from us. So we rightfully deserve a chance to board. Seeing that Gu Ziming had remained silent, all the newcomers at Jinkong chose a negotiation representative to begin speaking. On the northern base side, there was a growing sense of panic among the people. They all knew that the capacity of the spacecraft was limited. Adding one more person, there would mean one less person here. Some people had already begun to silently pray in their hearts, hoping that President Gu wouldn't agree to the demands from the other side. The newcomer does not come with good intentions. When Liang Gong also heard the loud voice from the broadcast and let out a slight sigh, his worst fears had come true. Long before the spaceship's capacity was set, he had anticipated such a situation. If some people wanted to come but couldn't, they would definitely become envious. However, for the past 3 years, everything had gone smoothly in production, and even after assembly was completed, there had been no conflicts. But unexpectedly, just as they were about to board the ship and set off, a conflict broke out between the pro-expedition faction and the pro-stay faction. Moreover, he hadn't anticipated that this outbreak would be so intense and rapid. Geneport was too close to them. A few nuclear missiles could cause tremendous damage. Logically, Gu Ziming, that cheap son-in-law, should have considered these issues long ago. So why hadn't he taken action? Wen Liangong felt somewhat puzzled, but his current task was to maintain order and prevent internal chaos, so he couldn't seek out Gu Ziming for clarity. Sure enough, after a while, there was still no response from Gu Ziming at Geneport. He didn't even acknowledge their demands, and in frustration, he shouted, "Gu Ziming, we have already locked onto the position of your spaceship, and we currently have sufficient nuclear missiles in hand. If you do not respond, we will assume that you have rejected our proposal. I will count 10 seconds. After 10 seconds, I will launch a missile to show you our determination. By then, the worst outcome will be that we all stay on Blue Star together, and no one can go to space." As the negotiating representative spoke with rising agitation, the emotions of those present were completely infected, and they began to count down. 10, 9. Qin Feifei and X's would naturally not actually launch nuclear missiles. This condition was purely to force Gu Ziming to make a quick decision. Their primary goal was still to seize control of the spaceship. If it were destroyed, they would be the first to object. Only by using this kind of overwhelming public opinion to pressure Gu Ziming could they create immense pressure on him and then force him to make a decision in a very short time. Such decisions are often impulsive and blind. Generally speaking, people would comply immediately after being pressured like this. At that time, they would be able to take over the spaceship directly. As for the refugees, they decided to squeeze out one last bit of value from them and eliminate them all afterward to avoid wasting food. 5, 4. I'll help you count. A voice like a storm suddenly echoed in everyone's ears. Whether it was the people at the northern base or those at Geneport, even some small wandering ability users around the imperial capital heard this indifferent man's voice. What's going on? Ah, who is speaking? Everyone shook their heads, scanning the surrounding crowd to see who was speaking in their ears, only to find that this voice had seemingly appeared out of thin air near their ears. There was no trace at all. 3, 2. For some unknown reason, Qin Feifei, standing on the deck, felt his heart racing wildly. A wave of fear that seemed to come from the abyss surged through his mind, making his scalp tingle and his heart pound painfully. Am I going to die? This thought suddenly flashed in Qin Feifei's mind, and at that moment, fragments of images flashed through his mind, as if from a parallel universe. In that parallel universe, he had everything. He was surrounded by beautiful women and admired by thousands. There, he led all the survivors of the world and was responsible for building the most advanced spaceship. He named the spaceship Noah's Ark, symbolizing that he was the god here to save the people. In that place, there was no one more powerful than Gu Ziming, and there were no strange abilities, only a normal technological apocalypse world. Moreover, he possessed a mechanical heart that surpassed that world by 200 years. He was the only hero in that world. His magnificent journey had just begun, and his future lay within the vast cosmos. Thinking of this, Qin Feifei finally revealed a satisfied smile for the first time. 7 days later, at the boarding entrance. "Hi, Boss Gu, I'm really happy to see you again," said Yodalu, the leader of the European Union delegation, looking somewhat fatigued. "I'm glad too. I didn't expect you really came." Gu Ziming shook hands with Yodalu and nodded. "Quickly look at my spoils, Boss Gu. These are supplies I seized from the Western Plateau." As he spoke, Yodalu handed a list to Gu Ziming. That's right. Long before the First World Conference ended, Yodalu had pledged allegiance to Gu Ziming. At that time, Gu Ziming had not taken it seriously, saying it was for an investigation for a year. A year later, when Yodalu proposed allegiance again, Gu Ziming then placed a mental defense on him, so that he would no longer be detected by X's. After that, he had been an undercover agent in Qin Feifei's so-called anti-Gu alliance. In the last period of time, Gu Ziming sent him to plunder supplies from countries like the island nations that were building bases in the Western Plateau. This was also the reason he hadn't appeared for a while. Gu Ziming did not look at the list. Instead, he patted Yodalu on the shoulder and nodded, saying, "Well done, go in. The western area is yours to manage for now." "Thank you, boss." Yodalu gave a salute and then rushed onto the spaceship. "Are we not coming back anymore?" Qin Feifei and the other women linked arms with Gu Ziming, turning back to look at the entire land soaked by the sea, feeling somewhat sentimental as they asked. 7 days ago, a massive wave swept across the entire land, flooding Jin Port and the imperial capital completely. The base here had taken protective measures early because Gu Ziming had informed them in advance, so losses were minimal. But the entire Jin Port had indeed been submerged once, and all the people in Jin Port had completely disappeared. At this moment, the people at the base truly realized Gu Ziming's strength. That kind of earth-shattering, transformative ability was not something human power could achieve. Only divine power could do it. Yihan had been scheming to become a king, but in just a moment, Gu Ziming had achieved it. Now, everyone on the spaceship regarded him as their only king. But everyone was unaware that if it were solely the tsunami, it would not be enough to cause the deaths of all those people. 1 second before the tsunami struck, that is, when he counted to 2, a spatial cutting network descended from the entire sky. This was the true killer weapon that left no survivors. This killer weapon was not just aimed at the people of Jin Port. It also included everyone marked in red on the maps within the base. Before boarding the ship, Gu Ziming hoped to eliminate everyone who held hostility toward him, regardless of whether they posed a threat or how much contribution they had made before. The ultimate doctrine of the villain. I would rather be hated by the world than let the world hate me. Whether sending people to plunder supplies or eliminating enemies, these were the things a villain should do. After this wave of cleansing was completed, only about 800,000 boarding personnel remained. Although the number was smaller, the relative living space was much larger, and everyone's standard of living improved significantly. Gu Ziming, along with Qin Feifei and the others, boarded the spaceship last. The spaceship door closed, and the 4 curved microparticle engines had already warmed up and started. The spaceship slowly ascended and accelerated. Gu Ziming looked through the porthole at the outline of a gigantic blue planet, sighing. "I can't say for sure whether we will return again. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. After all, we humans are just tenants of Blue Star. She has allowed us to live here for free for so long, and I am already very grateful to her."